Chapter 44 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Piotr Natter. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1 by Song Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Alan Giles. Chapter 44. The Young Man Who Couldn't Spell. Translator's Note. Of course, there is no such thing as spelling, in our sense of term, in Chinese, but characters are frequently written with too many or too few strokes, and may thus be said to be incorrectly spelled. End of note. At Chia-ping there lived a certain young gentleman of considerable talent and very prepossessing appearance. When 17 years of age, he went up for his bachelor's degree, and as he was passing the door of a house, he saw within a pretty-looking girl, who not only riveted his gaze, but also smiled and nodded her head at him. Quite pleased at this, he approached the young lady and began to talk, she meanwhile inquiring of him where he lived and if alone or otherwise. He assured her he was quite by himself, and then she said, "Well, I will come and see you, but you mustn't let anyone know." The young gentleman agreed, and when he got home he sent all the servants to another part of the house, and by the young lady arrived. She said her name was Wen Chi, and that her admiration for her host's noble bearing had made her visit him unknown to her mistress. "And gladly," added she, "would I be your handmaid for life." Our hero was delighted, and proposed to purchase her from the mistress she mentioned. And from this time she was in the habit of coming in every day or so. On one occasion it was raining hard, and after hanging up her wet cloak upon a peg, she took off her shoes and bade the young gentleman clean them for her. He noticed that they were newly embroidered with all the colors of the rainbow, but utterly spoiled by the soaking rain, and was just saying what a pity it was, when the young lady cried out, "I should never have asked you to do such menial work, except to show my love for you." All this time the rain was falling fast outside, and Wen Chi now repeated the following line: "A nipping wind and chilling rain fill the river and the city." "There," said she, "cap that." The young gentleman replied that he could not, as he did not even understand what it meant. "Oh, really," retorted the young lady, "if you're not more of a scholar than that, I shall begin to think very little of you." She then told him that he had better practice making verses, and he promised he would do so. By degrees Miss Wen Chi's frequent visits attracted the notice of the servants, as also of a brother-in-law named Tseng, who was likewise a gentleman of position, and the latter begged our hero to be allowed to have a peep at her. He was told in reply that the young lady had strictly forbidden that anyone should see her. However, he concealed himself in the servants' quarters, and when she arrived he looked at her through the window. Almost beside himself, he now opened the door, whereupon Wen Chi jumped up, vaulted over the wall, and disappeared. Tseng was really smitten with her, and went off to her mistress to try and arrange for her purchase. But when he mentioned Wen Chi's name, he was informed that they had once such a girl, who had died several years previously. In great amazement Tseng went back and told his brother-in-law, and he now knew that his beloved Wen Chi was a disembodied spirit. So, when she came again, he asked her if it was so, to which she replied, "It is, but as you wanted a nice wife, and I a handsome husband, I thought we should be a suitable pair. What matters it that one is a mortal and the other a spirit?" The young gentleman thoroughly coincided in her view of the case, and when his examination was over, and he was homeward bound, Wen Chi accompanied him, invisible to others and visible to him alone. Arriving at his parents' house, he installed her in the library, and the day she went to pay the customary bride's visit to her father and mother, Translator's Note, a ceremonial visit made on the 3rd day after marriage. End of note. He told his own mother the whole story. She and his father were greatly alarmed, and ordered him to have no more to do with her. But he would not listen to this, and then his parents tried by all kinds of devices to get rid of the girl, none of which met with any success. One day our hero had left upon the table some written instructions for one of his servants, wherein he had made a number of mistakes in spelling, such as paper for pepper ginger for ginger, and so on. And when Wenchi saw this, she wrote at the foot, "Paper for pepper do I see? Ginger for ginger, can it be? Of such a husband I'm afraid. I'd rather be a servant maid." She then said to the young gentleman, "Imagining you to be a man of culture, I hid my blushes and sought you out the first." Translator's note. Contrary to all Chinese notions of modesty and etiquette. End of note. "Alas, your qualifications are on the outside. Should I not thus be a laughing-stock to all?" She then disappeared, at which the young gentleman was much hurt, but not knowing to which she alluded, he gave the instructions to his servant, and so made himself the butt of all who heard the story. End of section 44.
Chapter 45 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Songling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 45. The Tiger Guest. A young man named Kung, a native of Minchu, on his way to the examination at a Xingan, rested a while in an inn, and ordered some wine to drink. Just then a very tall and noble-looking stranger walked in, and, seating himself by the side of Kung, entered into conversation with him. Kung offered him a cup of wine, which the stranger did not refuse, saying at the same time that his name was Miao. But he was a rough, coarse fellow, and Kung therefore, when the wine was finished, did not call for any more. Miao then rose, and observing that Kung did not appreciate a man of his capacity, went out into the market to buy some, returning shortly with a huge bowlful. Kung declined the proffered wine, but Miao, seizing his arm to persuade him, gripped it so painfully that Kung was forced to drink a few more cups, Miao himself swilling away as hard as he could go out of a soup-plate. "I am not good at entertaining people," cried Miao at length. "Pray go on or stop, just as you please." Kung accordingly put together his things and went off, but he had not gone more than a few miles when his horse was taken ill and lay down in the road. While he was waiting there, with all his heavy baggage, revolving in his mind what he should do, up came Mr. Miao, who, when he heard what was the matter, took off his coat and handed it to the servant, and lifting up the horse, carried it off on his back to the nearest inn, which was about 6 or 7 miles distant. Arriving there, he put the animal in the stable, and before long Kung and his servants arrived too. Kung was much astonished at Mr. Miao's feat, and, believing him to be superhuman, began to treat him with the utmost deference, ordering both wine and food to be procured for their refreshment. "My appetite," remarked Miao, "is one that you could not easily satisfy. Let us stick to wine." So they finished another stoup together, and then Miao got up and took his leave, saying, "It will be some time before your horse is well. I cannot wait for you." He then went away. After the examination, several friends of Kung's invited him to join them in a picnic to the Flowery Hill, and just as they were all feasting and laughing together, lo! Mr. Miao walked up. In one hand he held a large flagon, and in the other a ham, both of which he laid down on the ground before them. "Hearing," said he, "that you gentlemen were coming here, I have tacked myself on to you, like a fly to a horse's tail." Kung and his friends then rose, and received him with the usual ceremonies, after which they all sat down promiscuously. By and by, when the wine had gone round pretty freely, some one proposed capping verses, whereupon Miao cried out, "Oh, we're very jolly drinking like this. What's the use of making oneself uncomfortable?" The others, however, would not listen to him, and agreed that, as a forfeit, a huge goblet of wine should be drunk by any defaulter. "Let us rather make death the penalty," said Miao. To which they replied, laughing, that such a punishment was a trifle too severe, and then Miao retorted that if it was not to be death, even a rough fellow like himself might be able to join. A Mr. Chin, who was sitting at the top of the line, then began: "From the hilltop high, wide extends the gaze," upon which Miao immediately carried on with, "Redly gleams the sword o'er the shattered vase." The next gentleman thought for a long time, during which Miao was helping himself to wine, and by they had all capped the verse, but so wretchedly that Miao called out, "Oh, come, if we aren't to be fined for these, we had better abstain from making any more." As none of them would agree to this, Miao could stand it no longer, and roared like a dragon till the hills and valleys echoed again. He then went down on his hands and knees, and jumped about like a lion, which utterly confused the poets, and put an end to their lucubrations. The wine had now been round a good many times, and being half tipsy, each began to repeat to the other the verses he had handed in at the recent examination, all at the same time indulging in any amount of mutual flattery. This so disgusted Miao that he drew Kung aside to have a game at guess fingers, but as they went on droning away all the same, he at length cried out, "Do stop your rubbish, but only for your own wives, and not for general company." The others were much abashed at this, and so angry were they at Miao's rudeness that they went on repeating all the louder. Miao then threw himself on the ground in a passion, and with a roar changed into a tiger, immediately springing upon the company and killing them all, except Kung and Mr. Chim. He then ran off, roaring loudly. And now this Mr. Chim succeeded in taking his master's degree, and 3 years afterwards, happening to revisit the Flowery Hill, he beheld a Mr. Chi, one of those very gentlemen who had previously been killed by the tiger. In great alarm he was making off, when Chi seized his bridle and would not let him proceed. So he got down from his horse and inquired what was the matter, to which Chi replied, "I am now the slave of Miao, and have to endure bitter toil for him. He must kill some one else before I can be set free. 3 days hence a man arrayed in the robes and cap of a scholar should be eaten by the tiger at the foot of the Tseng Lung Hill. Do you on that day take some gentleman thither, and thus help your old friend." Chin was too frightened to say much, but promising that he would do so, rode away home. He then began to consider the matter over with himself, and regarding it as a plot, he determined to break his engagement and let his friend remain the tiger's devil. He chanced, however, to repeat the story to a Mr. Tseng, who was a relative of his, and one of the local scholars; and as this gentleman had a grudge against another scholar named Yu, who had come out equal with him at the examination, he made up his mind to destroy him. So he invited Yu to accompany him on that day to the place in question, mentioning that he himself should appear in undress only. Yu could not make out the reason for this, but when he reached the spot, there he found all kinds of wine and food ready for his entertainment. Now that very day the prefect had come to the hill, and being a friend of the Chiang family, and hearing that Chiang was below, sent for him to come up. Chiang did not dare to appear before him in undress, and borrowed Yu's clothes and hat; but he had no sooner got them on than out rushed the tiger, and carried him away in its mouth. End of chapter 45.
Chapter 46 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song-Ling Pu, translated by Herbert A. Giles. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jane Dever. Chapter 46. The Sisters. His Excellency the Grand Secretary Mao came from an obscure family in the district of Ye, his father being only a poor cowherd. At the same place there resided a wealthy gentleman named Tseng, who owned a burial ground in the neighbourhood, and some one informed him that while passing by he had heard sounds of wrangling from within the grave, and voices saying, "Make haste and go away. Do not disturb His Excellency's home." Chang did not much believe this, but subsequently he had several dreams in which he was told that the burial ground in question really belonged to the Mao family, and that he had no right whatever to it. From this moment the affairs of his house began to go wrong, and at length he listened to the remonstrances of friends and removed his dead elsewhere. One day Mao's father, the cowherd, was out near this burial ground, when, a storm of raining coming on, he took refuge in the now empty grave, while the rain came down harder than ever, and by flooded the whole place and drowned the old man. The Grand Secretary was then a mere boy, and his mother went off to Chang to beg a piece of ground wherein to bury her dead husband. When Chang heard her name he was greatly astonished, and on going to look at the spot where the old man was drowned, found that it was exactly at the proper place for the coffin. More than ever amazed, he gave orders that the body should be buried there in the old grave, and also bade Mao's mother bring her son to see him. When the funeral was over, she went with Mao to Mr. Chang's house to thank him for his kindness, and so pleased was he with the boy that he kept him to be educated, ranking him as one of his own sons. He also said he would give him his eldest daughter as a wife, an offer which Mao's mother hardly dared accept, but Mrs. Chang said that the thing was settled and couldn't be altered, so then she was obliged to consent. The young lady, however, had a great contempt for Mao, and made no effort to disguise her feelings, and if any one spoke to her of him, she would put her fingers in her ears, declaring she would die sooner than marry the cowboy. On the day appointed for the wedding, the bridegroom arrived, and was feasted within, while outside the door a handsome chair was in waiting to convey away the bride, who all this time was standing crying in a corner, wiping her eyes with her sleeve, and absolutely refusing to dress. Just then the bridegroom set in to say he was going, and the drums and trumpets struck up the wedding march, at which the bride's tears only fell the faster as her hair hung dishevelled down her back. Her father managed to detain Mao a while, and went in to urge his daughter to make haste, she weeping bitterly as if she did not hear what he was saying. He now got into a rage, which only made her cry the louder, and in the middle of it all a servant came to say the bridegroom wished to take his leave. The father ran out and said his daughter wasn't quite ready, begging Mao to wait a little longer, and then hurried back again to the bride. Thus they went on for some time, backwards and forwards, until at last things began to look serious, for the young lady obstinately refused to yield, and Mr. Tseng was ready to commit suicide for want of anything better. Just then his second daughter was standing by upbraiding her eldest sister for her disobedience, when suddenly the latter turned round in a rage and cried out, "So you are imitating the rest of them, you little minx! Why don't you go and marry him yourself?" "My father did not betroth me to Mr. Mao," answered she; "but if he had, I should not require you to persuade me to accept him." Her father was delighted with this reply, and at once went off and consulted with his wife as to whether they could venture to substitute the second for the elder; and then her mother came and said to her, "That bad girl there won't obey her parents' commands. We wish, therefore, to put you in her place. Will you consent to this arrangement?" The younger sister readily agreed, saying that had they told her to marry a beggar she would not have dared to refuse, and that she had not such a low opinion of Mr. Mao as all that. Her father and mother rejoiced exceedingly at receiving this reply, and dressing her up in her sister's clothes, put her in the bridal chair and sent her off. She proved an excellent wife, and lived in harmony with her husband; but she was troubled with a disease of the hair, which caused Mr. Mao some annoyance. Later on, she told him how she had changed places with her sister, and this made him think more highly of her than before. Soon after, Mao took his bachelor's degree, and then set off to present himself as a candidate for the master's degree. On the way he passed an inn, the landlord of which had dreamt the night before that a spirit appeared to him and said, "To-morrow Mr. Mao, first on the list, will come. Some day he will extricate you from a difficulty." Accordingly the landlord got up early, and took especial note of all guests who came from the eastward, until at last Mao himself arrived. The landlord was very glad to see him, and provided him with the best of everything, refusing to take any payment for it all, but telling what he had dreamt the night before. Mao now began to give himself airs, and reflecting that his wife's want of hair would make him look ridiculous, he determined that as soon as he attained to rank and power he would find another spouse. But alas, when the successful list of candidates was published, Mao's name was not among them, and he retraced his steps with a heavy heart, and by another road, so as to avoid meeting the innkeeper. 3 years afterwards he went up again, and the landlord received him with precisely the same attentions as on the previous occasion, upon which Mao said to him, "Your former words did not come true. I am now ashamed to put you to so much trouble." "Ah," replied the landlord, "you meant to get rid of your wife, and the ruler of the world below struck out your name. My dream couldn't have been false." In great astonishment Mao asked what he meant by these words, and then he learnt that after his departure the landlord had had a second dream, informing him of the above facts. Mao was much alarmed at what he heard, and remained as motionless as a wooden image, until the landlord said to him, "You, sir, as a scholar, should have more self-respect, and you will certainly take the highest place." By and by, when the list came out, Mao was the first of all, and almost simultaneously his wife's hair began to grow quite thick, making her much better looking than she had hitherto been. Now her elder sister had married a rich young fellow of good family, who lived in the neighbourhood, which made the young lady more contemptuous than ever; but he was so extravagant and so idle that their property was soon gone, and they were positively in want of food. Hearing, too, of Mr. Mao's success at the examination, she was overwhelmed with shame and vexation, and avoided even meeting her sister in the street. Just then her husband died and left her destitute, and about the same time Mao took his doctor's degree, which so aggravated her feelings that, in a passion, she became a nun. Subsequently, when Mao rose to be a high officer of state, she sent a novice to his yamen to try and get a subscription out of him for the temple; and Mao's wife, who gave several pieces of silk and other things, secretly inserted a sum of money among them. The novice, not knowing this, reported what she had received to the elder sister, who cried out in a passion, "I wanted money to buy food with. Of what use are these things to me?" So she bade the novice take them back; and when Mao and his wife saw her return, they suspected what had happened, and opening the parcel found the money still there. They now understood why the presents had been refused; and taking the money, Mao said to the novice, "If 100 ounces of silver is too much luck for your mistress to secure, of course she could never have secured a high official, such as I am now, for her husband." He then took 50 ounces, and giving them to the novice, sent her away, adding, "Hand this to your mistress. I'm afraid more would be too much for her." The novice returned and repeated all that had been said, and then the elder sister sighed to think what a failure her life had been, and how she had rejected the worthy to accept the worthless. After this, the innkeeper got into trouble about a case of murder, and was imprisoned; but Mao exerted his influence, and obtained the man's pardon. Chapter 46.
Chapter 47 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Olpecker. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song-Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 47. Foreign Priests. The Buddhist priest Ti-kung relates that when he was at Qingchao, he saw 2 foreign priests of very extraordinary appearance. They wore rings in their ears, were dressed in yellow cloth, and had curly hair and beards. They said they had come from the countries of the West, and hearing that the governor of the district was a devoted follower of Buddha, they went to visit him. The governor sent a couple of servants to escort them to the monastery of the place, where the abbot, Ling Pei, did not receive them very cordially. But the secular manager, seeing that they were not ordinary individuals, entertained them and kept them there for the night. Some one asked if there were many strange men in the West, and what magical arts were practised by the Lohans, whereupon one of them laughed, and putting forth his hand from his sleeve, showed a small pagoda, fully a foot in height, and beautifully carved, standing upon the palm. Now very high up in the wall there was a niche, and the priest threw the pagoda up to it, when, lo, it stood there firm and straight. After a few moments the pagoda began to incline to one side, and a glory, as from a relic of some saint, was diffused throughout the room. The other priest then bared his arms, and stretched out his left until it was 5 or 6 feet in length, at the same time shortening his right arm until it dwindled to nothing. He then stretched out the latter until it was as long as his left arm. End of chapter 47. Recording by J. Olpecker. Chapter 48 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Olpecker. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song-Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 48. The Self-Punished Murderer. Mr. Li took his doctor's degree late in life. On the 28th of the 9th moon of the 4th year of Kang-si, he killed his wife. The neighbors reported the murder to the officials, and the high authorities instructed the district magistrate to investigate the case. At this juncture, Mr. Li was standing at the door of his residence, and, snatching a butcher's knife from a stall hard by, he rushed into the Tseng temple, where, mounting the theatrical stage, he threw himself on his knees and spoke as follows. The spirit here will punish me. I am not to be prosecuted by evil men who, from party motives, confuse right and wrong. The spirit moves me to cut off an ear. Thereupon he cut off his left ear and threw it down from the stage. He then said the spirit was going to fine him a hand for cheating people out of their money, and he forthwith chopped off his left hand. Lastly, he cried out that he was to be punished severely for all his many crimes, and immediately cut his own throat. The viceroy subsequently received the imperial permission to deprive him of his rank and bring him to trial, but he was then being punished by a higher power in the realms of darkness below. End of chapter 48. Recording by J. Olpecker. Chapter 49. of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Olpecker. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 49. The Master Thief. Before his rebellion, Prince Wu frequently told his soldiers that if any one of them could catch a tiger unaided, he would give him a handsome pension and the title of the Tiger Daunter. In his camp there was a man named Pao Chu, as strong and agile as a monkey, and once, when a new tower was being built, the wooden framework having only just been set up, Pao Chu walked along the eaves and finally got up onto the very tip-top beam, where he ran backwards and forwards several times. He then jumped down, alighting safely on his feet. Now Prince Wu had a favorite concubine who was a skillful player on the guitar, and the nuts of the instrument she used were of warm jade, so that, when played upon, there was a general feeling of warmth throughout the room. The young lady was extremely careful of this treasure, and never produced it for anyone to see unless on receipt of the prince's written order. One night, in the middle of a banquet, a guest begged to be allowed to see this wonderful guitar, but the prince, being in a lazy mood, said it should be exhibited to him on the following day. Pao Chu, who was standing by, then observed that he could get it without troubling the prince to write an order. Someone was therefore sent off beforehand to instruct all the officials to be on the watch, and then the prince told Pao Chu he might go, and after scaling numerous walls, the latter found himself near the lady's room. Lamps were burning brightly within, the doors were bolted and barred, and it was impossible to effect an entrance. Under the veranda, however, was a cockatoo fast asleep on its perch, and Pao Chu, first mewing several times like a cat, followed it up by imitating the voice of the bird, and cried out as though in distress, "The cat! The cat!" He then heard the concubine call to one of the slave girls, and bid her go rescue the cockatoo which was being killed, and, hiding himself in a dark corner, he saw a girl come forth with a light in her hand. She had barely got outside the door when he rushed in, and there he saw the lady sitting with the guitar on a table before her. Seizing the instrument, he turned and fled, upon which the concubine shrieked out, "Thieves! Thieves!" And the guard, seeing a man making off with the guitar, at once started in pursuit. Arrows fell round Pao Chu like drops of rain, but he climbed up one of a number of huge ash trees growing there, and from its top leaped onto the top of the next, and so on, until he had reached the furthermost tree, when he jumped on to the roof of a house, and from that to another, more as if he were flying than anything else. In a few minutes he had disappeared, and before long presented himself suddenly at the banquet table with the guitar in his hand, the entrance gate having been securely barred all the time, and not a dog or a cock aroused. End of chapter 49. Recording by J. Olpecker. Chapter 50 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Olpecker. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song-Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 50. A Flood. In the 21st year of Kang-si, there was a severe drought, not a green blade appearing in the parched ground all through the spring and well into the summer. On the 13th of the 6th moon, a little rain fell, and people began to plant their rice. On the 18th, there was a heavy fall, and beans were sown. Now, at a certain village there was an old man who, noticing 2 bullocks fighting on the hills, told the villagers that a great flood was at hand, and forthwith removed his family to another part of the country. The villagers all laughed at him, but before very long rain began to fall in torrents, lasting all through the night, until the water was several feet deep, and carrying away the houses. Among the others was a man who, neglecting to save his 2 children, with his wife assisted his aged mother to reach a place of safety, from which they looked down at their old home, now only an expanse of water, without hope of ever seeing the children again. When the flood had subsided, they went back, to find the whole place a complete ruin. But in their own house they discovered the 2 boys playing and laughing on the bed, as if nothing had happened. Someone remarked that this was a reward for the filial piety of the parents. It happened on the 20th of the 6th moon. End of chapter 50. Recording by J. Olpecker. Chapter 51 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Olpecker. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song-Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 51. Death by Laughing. A Mr. Sun Ching Sha, a marshal of undergraduates, told me that in his village there was a certain man who had been killed by the rebels when they passed through the place. The man's head was left hanging down on his chest, and as soon as the rebels had gone, his servants secured the body and were about to bury it. Hearing, however, a sound of breathing, they looked more closely and found that the windpipe was not wholly severed, and, setting his head in its proper place, they carried him back home. In 24 hours he began to moan, and by dint of carefully feeding him with a spoon, within 6 months he had quite recovered. Some 10 years afterwards he was chatting with a few friends, when one of them made a joke which called forth loud applause from the others. Our hero, too, clapped his hands, but as he was bending backwards and forwards with laughter, the seam on his neck split open, and down fell his head with a gush of blood. His friends now found that he was quite dead, and his father immediately commenced an action against the joker. But a sum of money was subscribed by those present and given to the father, who buried his son and stopped further proceedings. Footnote: the Chinese distinguish 5 degrees of homicide, of which accidental homicide is one. See Penal Code, Book 6. Thus, if a gun goes off of itself in a man's hand and kills a bystander, the holder of the gun is guilty of homicide. But were the same gun lying on a table, it would be regarded as the will of heaven. Similarly, a man is held responsible for any death caused by an animal belonging to him, though in such cases the affair can usually be hushed up by a money payment, no notice being taken of crimes in general unless at the instigation of a prosecutor, at whose will the case may be subsequently withdrawn. Where the circumstances are purely accidental, the law admits of a money compensation. End of chapter 51. Recording by J. Olpecker. Chapter 52 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Olpecker. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 52. Playing at Hanging. A number of wild young fellows were one day out walking, when they saw a young lady approach, riding on a pony. One of them said to the others, "I'll back myself to make that girl laugh," and a supper was at once staked by both sides on the result. Our hero then ran out in front of the pony and kept on shouting, "I'm going to die! I'm going to die!" at the same time pulling out from over the top of a wall a stalk of millet, to which he attached his own waistband, and, tying the latter round his neck, made a pretence of hanging himself. The young lady did laugh as she passed by, to the great amusement of the assembled company. But as when she was already some distance off, their friend did not move, the others laughed louder than ever. However, on going up to him, they saw that his tongue protruded, and that his eyes were glazed. He was, in fact, quite dead. Was it not strange that a man should be able to hang himself on a millet stalk? It is a good warning against practical joking. End of chapter 52. Recording by J. Olpecker. Chapter 53 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Olpecker. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song-Ling Poo. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 53. The Rat Wife. Si Shan was a native of Cao Mi, and a trader by occupation. He frequently slept at a place called Meng-yi. One day he was delayed on the road by rain, and when he arrived at his usual quarters it was already late in the night. He knocked at all the doors, but no one answered, and he was walking backwards and forwards in the piazza when suddenly a door flew open and an old man came out. He invited the traveler to enter, an invitation to which Si Shan gladly responded, and tying up his mule, he went in. The place was totally unfurnished, and the old man began by saying that it was only out of compassion that he had asked him in, as his house was not an inn. "There are only 3 or 4 of us," added he, "and my wife and daughter are fast asleep. We have some of yesterday's food, which I will get ready for you. You must not object to its being cold." He then went within, and shortly afterwards returned with a low couch, which he placed on the ground, begging his guest to be seated, at the same time hurrying back for a low table, and soon for a number of other things, until at last Si Shan was quite uncomfortable, and entreated his host to rest himself a while. By and by a young lady came out, bringing some wine, upon which the old man said, "Oh, our A-ch'ien has got up." She was about 16 or 17, a slender and pretty-looking girl, and as Si Shan had an unmarried brother, he began to think directly that she would do for him. So he inquired of the old man his name and address, to which the latter replied that his name was Ku, and that his children had all died save this one daughter. "I didn't like to wake her just now, but I suppose my wife told her to get up." Si Shan then asked the name of his son-in-law, and was informed that the young lady was not yet engaged, at which he was secretly very much pleased. A tray of food was now brought in, evidently the remains from the day before, and when he had finished eating, Hsi Shan began respectfully to address the old man as follows. "I am only a poor wayfarer, but I shall never forget the kindness with which you have treated me. Let me presume upon it, and submit to your consideration a plan I have in my head. My younger brother, San Lang, is 17 years old. He is a student, and by no means unsteady or dull. May I hope that you will unite our families together, and not think it presumption on my part?" "I, too, am but a temporary sojourner," replied the old man, rejoicing, "and if you will only let me have a part of your house, I shall be very glad to come and live with you." Hsi Shan consented to this, and got up and thanked him for the promise of his daughter, upon which the old man set to work to make him comfortable for the night, and then went away. At cock-crow he was outside, calling his guest to come and have a wash, and when Hsi Shan had packed up ready to go, he offered to pay for his night's entertainment. This, however, the old man refused, saying, "I could hardly charge a stranger anything for a single meal. How much less could I take money from my intended son-in-law?" They then separated, and in about a month Hsi Shan returned. But when he was a short distance from the village, he met an old woman with a young lady, both dressed in deep mourning. As they approached, he began to suspect it was A Chien, and the young lady, after turning round to look at him, pulled the old woman's sleeve and whispered something in her ear, which Hsi Shan himself did not hear. The old woman stopped immediately, and asked if she was addressing Mr. Hsi. And when informed that she was, she said mournfully, "Alas, my husband has been killed by the falling of a wall. We are going to bury him today. There is no one at home, but please wait here, and we will be back by and by." They then disappeared among the trees, and, returning after a short absence, they walked along together in the dusk of the evening. The old woman complained bitterly of their lonely and helpless state, and Hsi Shan himself was moved to compassion by the sight of her tears. She told him that the people of the neighborhood were a bad lot, and that if he thought of marrying the poor widow's daughter, he had better lose no time in doing so. Hsi Shan said he was willing, and when they reached the house, the old woman, after lighting the lamp and setting food before him, proceeded to speak as follows. "Knowing, sir, that you would shortly arrive, we sold all our grain except about 20 piculs. We cannot take this with us so far. But a mile or so to the north of the village, at the first house you come to, there lives a man named Tan Chuan, who often buys grain from me. Don't think it too much trouble to oblige me by taking a sack with you on your mule and proceeding thither at once. Tell Mr. Tan that the old lady of the southern village has several piculs of grain, which she wishes to sell in order to get money for a journey, and beg him to send some animals to carry it." The old woman then gave him a sack of grain, and Hsi Shan, whipping up his mule, was soon at the place, and, knocking at the door, a great fat fellow came out, to whom he told his errand. Emptying the sack he had brought, he went back himself first, and before long a couple of men arrived, leading 5 mules. The old woman took them into the granary, which was a cellar below ground, and Hsi Shan, going down himself, handed up the bags to the mother and daughter, who passed them on from one to the other. In a little while the men had got a load, with which they went off, returning altogether 4 times before all the grain was exhausted. They then paid the old woman, who kept 1 man and 2 mules, and, packing up her things, set off towards the east. After travelling some 7 miles, day began to break, and by they reached a market town, where the old woman hired animals and sent back Tan's servant. When they arrived at Hsi Shan's home, he related the whole story to his parents, who were very pleased at what had happened, and provided separate apartments for the old lady, at the same time engaging a fortune-teller to fix on a lucky day for Ah Qian's marriage with their son San Lang. The old woman prepared a handsome trousseau, and as for Ah Qian herself, she spoke but little, seldom losing her temper, and if anyone addressed her, she would only reply with a smile. She employed all her time in spinning, and thus became a general favorite with all alike. "Tell your brother," said she to San Lang, "that when he happens to pass our old residence, he will do well not to make any mention of my mother and myself." In 3 or 4 years' time, the Hsi family had made plenty of money, and San Lang had taken his bachelor's degree, when one day Hsi Shan happened to pass a night with the people who lived next door to the house where he had met Ah Qian. After telling them the story of his having had nowhere to sleep, and taking refuge with the old man and woman, his host said to him, "You must make a mistake, sir. The house you allude to belongs to my uncle, but was abandoned 3 years ago in consequence of its being haunted. It has now been uninhabited for a long time. What old man and woman can have entertained you there?" Hsi Shan was very much astonished at this, but did not put much faith in what he heard. Meanwhile his host continued, "For 10 years no one dared enter the house. However, one day the back wall fell down, and my uncle, going to look at it, found, half buried underneath the ruins, a large rat, almost as big as a cat. It was still moving, and my uncle went off to call for assistance, but when he got back, the rat had disappeared. Everyone suspected some supernatural agency to be at work, though on returning to the spot 10 days afterwards nothing was to be either heard or seen, and about a year subsequently the place was inhabited once more." Hsi Shan was more than ever amazed at what he now heard, and on reaching home told the family what had occurred, for he feared that his brother's wife was not a human being, and became rather anxious about him. San Lang himself continued to be much attached to Ah Qian, but by and by the other members of the family let Ah Qian perceive that they had suspicions about her. So one night she complained to San Lang, saying, "I have been a good wife to you for some years. Now I have become an object of contempt. I pray you give me my divorce, and seek for yourself some worthier mate." She then burst into a flood of tears, whereupon San Lang said, "You should know my feelings by this time. Ever since you entered the house, the family has prospered, and that prosperity is entirely due to you. Who can say it is not so?" "I know full well," replied A ch'ien, "what you feel. Still there are the others, and I do not wish to share the fate of an autumn fan." At length San lang succeeded in pacifying her. But Si Shan could not dismiss the subject from his thoughts, and gave out that he was going to get a first-rate mouser with a view to testing A ch'ien. She did not seem very frightened at this, though evidently ill at ease, and one night she told San lang that her mother was not very well, and that he needn't come to bid her good night as usual. In the morning mother and daughter had disappeared, at which San lang was greatly alarmed, and sent out to look for them in every direction. No traces of the fugitives could be discovered, and San lang was overwhelmed with grief, unable either to eat or to sleep. His father and brother thought it was a lucky thing for him, and advised him to console himself with another wife. This, however, he refused to do, until about a year afterwards, nothing more having been heard of A ch'ien, he could not resist their importunities any longer, and bought himself a concubine. But he never ceased to think of A ch'ien, and some years later, when the prosperity of the family was on the wane, they all began to regret her loss. Now San lang had a step-brother named Lan, who, when travelling to Chao Chou on business, passed a night at the house of a relative named Lu. He noticed that during the night sounds of weeping and lamentation proceeded from their next-door neighbours, but he did not inquire the reason of it. However, on his way back he heard the same sounds, and then asked what was the cause of such demonstrations. Mr. Lu told him that a few years ago an old widow and her daughter had come there to live, and that the mother had died about a month previously, leaving her child quite alone in the world. Lan inquired what her name was, and Mr. Lu said it was Ku. "But," added he, "the door's closely barred, and as they never had any communication with the village, I know nothing of their antecedents." "It's my sister-in-law," cried Lan in amazement, and at once proceeded to knock at the door of the house. Someone came to the front door, and said in a voice that betokened recent weeping, "Who's there? There are no men in this house." Lan looked through a crack, and saw that the young lady really was his sister-in-law. So he called out, "Sister, open the door. I am your step-brother, A sui." A ch'ien immediately opened the door and asked him in, and recounted to him the whole story of her troubles. "Your husband," said Lan, "is always thinking of you. For a trifling difference you need hardly have run away so far from him." He then proposed to hire a vehicle and take her home, but A ch'ien replied, "I came hither with my mother to hide, because I was held in contempt, and should make myself ridiculous by now returning thus. If I am to go back, my elder brother Si Shan must no longer live with us, otherwise I will assuredly poison myself." Lan then went home and told San lang, who set off and travelled all night until he reached the place where A ch'ien was. Husband and wife were overjoyed to meet again, and the following day San lang notified the landlord of the house where A ch'ien had been living. Now this landlord had long desired to secure A Ch'ien as a concubine for himself, and after making no claim for rent for several years, he began to hint as much to her mother. The old lady, however, refused flatly, but shortly afterwards she died, and then the landlord thought that he might be able to succeed. At this juncture San Lang arrived, and the landlord sought to hamper him by putting in his claim for rent. And as San Lang was anything but well off at the moment, it really did annoy him very much. A Ch'ien here came to the rescue, showing San Lang a large quantity of grain she had in the house, and bidding him use it to settle accounts with the landlord. The latter declared he could not accept grain, but must be paid in silver, whereupon A Ch'ien sighed and said it was all her unfortunate self that had brought this upon them, at the same time telling San Lang of the landlord's former proposition. San Lang was very angry, and was about to take out a summons against him, when Mr. Lu interposed, and, by selling the grain in the neighborhood, managed to collect sufficient money to pay off the rent. San Lang and his wife then returned home, and the former, having explained the circumstances to his parents, separated his household from that of his brother. A Ch'ien now proceeded to build, with her own money, a granary, which was a matter of some astonishment to the family, there not being 100 weight of grain in the place. But in about a year the granary was full, and before very long San Lang was a rich man, Si Shan remaining as poor as before. Accordingly, A Ch'ien persuaded her husband's parents to come and live with them, and made frequent presents of money to the elder brother, so that her husband said, "Well, at any rate, you bear no malice." "Your brother's behavior," replied she, "was from his regard for you. Had it not been for him, you and I would never have met." After this, there were no more supernatural manifestations. End of chapter 53. Recording by J. Olpecker.
Chapter 54 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are on the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry, Johnson City, Tennessee. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Su Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 54. The Man Who Was Thrown Down a Well. Mr. Tai of Anxing was a wild fellow when young. One day, when he was returning home tipsy, he met by the way a dead cousin of his named Chi, and having, in his drunken state, quite forgotten that his cousin was dead, he asked him where he was going. "I am already a disembodied spirit," replied Chi. "Don't you remember?" Tai was a little disturbed at this, but being under the influence of liquor, he was not frightened, and inquired of his cousin what he was doing in the realms below. "I am employed as scribe," said Chi, "in the court of the great king." "Then you must know all about our happiness and misfortunes to come," cried Tai. "It was my business," answered his cousin, "so of course I know. But I see such an enormous mass that, unless of special reference to myself or family, I take no notice of any of it. 3 days ago, by the way, I saw your name in the register." Tai immediately asked what there was about himself, and his cousin replied, "I will not deceive you. Your name was put down for a dark and dismal hell." Tai was dreadfully alarmed, and at the same time sobered, and entreated his cousin to assist him in some way. "You may try," said Chai. "What merit will do you as a means of mitigating your punishment? But the register of your sins is as thick as my finger, and nothing short of the most deserving acts will be of any avail. What can a poor fellow like myself do for you? Were you to perform one good act every day, you would not complete the necessary total under a year and more, and it is now too late for that. But henceforth amend your ways, and there may be a chance of escape for you." When Tai heard these words, he prostrated himself on the ground, imploring his cousin to help him. But on raising his head, Chai had disappeared, and therefore returned softly home, and set to work to cleanse his heart and order his behavior. Now Tai's next-door neighbor had long suspected him of paying too much attention to his wife, and one day meeting Tai in the fields shortly after the events narrated above, he inveigled him into inspecting a dry well, and then pushed him down. The well was many feet deep, and the man felt certain that Tai was killed. However, in the middle of the night he came round, and sitting at the bottom, he began to shout for assistance, but could not make any one hear him. On the following day, the neighbor, fearing that Tai might possibly have recovered consciousness, he went to listen at the mouth of the well, and hearing him cry out for help, and began to throw down a quantity of stones. Tai took refuge in a cave at the side, and did not dare utter another sound. But his enemy knew he was not dead, and forthwith filled the well almost to the top with earth. In the cave it was dark as pitch, exactly like the infernal regions, and not being able to get anything to eat or drink, Tai gave up all hopes of life. He crawled on his hands and knees further into the cave, but was prevented by water from going further than a few paces, and returned to take up his position at the old spot. At first he felt hungry. By and by, however, this sensation passed away, and then reflecting that there at the bottom of the well he could hardly perform any good action, he passed his time in calling loudly on the name of Buddha. Before long he saw a number of will-o'-wisps flittering over the water and illuminating the glow of the cave, and immediately prayed to them, saying, "O Willy the Wisps, I have heard that ye are the shades of wronged and injured people. I have not long to live, and am without hope of escape. Still I would gladly relieve the monotony of my situation by exchanging a few words with you." Thereupon all the wills came flittering across the water to him, and among them was a man about half the ordinary size. Tai asked him whence he came, to which he replied, "This is an old coal mine. The proprietor, in working the coal, disturbed the position of some graves, and Mr. Lu Fei flooded the mine and drowned 43 workmen. We are the shades of those men." He further said that he did not know who Mr. Lu Fei was, except that he was secretary to the city god, and that in compassion for the misfortunes of the innocent workmen, he was in the habit of sending them a quantity of gruel every 3 or 4 days. "But the cold water," added he, "soaks into our bones, and there is but small chance of ever getting them removed. If, sir, you some day return to the world above, I pray you fish up our decaying bones, and bury them in some public burying ground. You will thus earn for yourself boundless gratitude in the realms below." Tai promised that if he had the luck to escape, he would do as they wished. "But how," cried he, "situated as I am, can I ever hope to look again upon the light of day?" He then began to teach the wills to say their prayers, making for them beads out of bits of mud, and repeating to them the liturgies of Buddha. He could not tell night from morning. He slept when he felt tired, and when he waked he sat up. Suddenly he perceived in the distance the light of lamps, at which the shades all rejoiced, and said, "It is Mr. Lu Fei with our food." They then invited Tai to go with them, and when he said he couldn't because of the water, they bore him along over it so that he hardly seemed to walk. After twisting and turning about for nearly a quarter of a mile, he reached a place at which the wills bade him walk by himself, and then he appeared to mount a flight of steps, at the top of which he found himself in an apartment lighted by a candle as thick round as one's arm. Not having seen the light of fire for some time, he was overjoyed and walked in, but observing an old man in a scholar's dress and cap seated in the post of honor, he stopped, not liking to advance further. But the old man had already caught sight of him, and asked him how he, a living man, had come there. Tai threw himself on the ground at his feet and told him all, whereupon the old man cried out, "My great-grandson!" He then bade him get up, and offering him a seat, explained that his own name was Tai Chien, and that he was otherwise known as Lu Fei. He said, moreover, that in days gone by a worthless grandson of his named Tang had associated himself with a lot of scoundrels, and sunk a well near his grave, disturbing the peace of his everlasting night, and that therefore he had flooded the place with salt water and drowned them. He then inquired as to the general condition of the family at that time. Now Tai was a descendant of one of the 5 brothers, from the eldest of whom Tang himself was also descended, and an influential man of the place had bribed Tseng to open a mine alongside the family grave. His brothers were afraid to interfere, and by the water rose and drowned all the workmen, whereupon actions for damages were commenced by the relatives of the deceased, and Tang and his friends were reduced to poverty, and Tang's descendants to absolute destitution. Tai was the son of one of Tang's brothers, and having heard this story from his seniors, now repeated it to the old man. "How could they be otherwise than unfortunate," cried the latter, "with such an unfilial progenitor? But since you have come hither, you must on no account neglect your studies." The old man then provided him with food and wine, and spreading a volume of essays according to the old style before him, bade him study it most carefully. He also gave him themes for composition, and corrected his essays as if he had been his tutor. The candle remained always burning in the room, never needing to be snuffed and never deceasing. When he was tired he would go to sleep, but he never knew day from night. The old man occasionally went out, leaving a boy to attend to his great-grandson's wants. It seemed that several years passed away thus, but Tai had no troubles of any kind to annoy him. He had no other book except the volume of essays, 100 in all, which he read through more than 4,000 times. One day the man said to him, "Your term of expiation is nearly completed, and you will be able to return to the world above. My grave is near the coal mine, and the gosser breeze plays upon my bones. Remember to remove them to Taiyuan." Tai promised that he would see to this, and then the old man summoned all the shades together, and instructed them to escort Tai back to the place where he had found him. The shades now bowed one after the other, and begged Tai to think of them as well. while Tai himself was quite at a loss to guess how he was going to get out. Meanwhile, Tai's family had searched for him everywhere, and his mother had brought his case to the notice of the officials, thereby implicating a large number of persons, but without getting any trace of the missing man. 3 or 4 years passed away, and there was a change of magistrate, in consequence of which the search was relaxed, and Tai's wife, not being happy where she was, married another husband. Just then an inhabitant of the place set about repairing the old well, and found Tai's body in the cave at the bottom. Touching it, he found it was not dead, and at once gave information to the family. Tai was promptly conveyed home, and within a day he could tell his own story. Since he had been down the well, the neighbor who pushed him in had beaten his own wife to death, and his father-in-law having brought an action against him, he had been in confinement for more than a year, while the case was being investigated. When released, he was a mere bag of bones, and then hearing that Tai had come back to life, he was terribly alarmed and fled away. The family tried to persuade Tai to take proceedings against him, but this would not do, alleging that what had befallen him was a proper punishment for his own bad behavior, and had nothing to do with the neighbor. Upon this, the said neighbor ventured to return, and when the water in the well had dried up, Tai hired men to go down and collect the bones, which he put in coffins and buried all together in one place. He next hunted up Mr. Lu Fei's name in the family tables of genealogy, and proceeded to sacrifice all kinds of nice things at his tomb. By and by, the literal chancellor heard this strange story, and was also very pleased with Tai's compositions accordingly. Tai passed successfully through his examinations, and having taken his master's degree, returned home and reburied Mr. Lu Fei at Tung-t'ing, repairing thither regularly every spring without fail. End of chapter 54. Recording by Larry, Johnson City, Tennessee.
Chapter 55 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song-Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 55. The Virtuous Daughter-In-Law. An Ta-cheng was a Tung-t'ing man. His father, who had gained the master's degree, died early, and his brother, Cheng, was a mere boy. He himself had married a wife from the Chen family, whose name was Shan-hu, and this young lady had much to put up with from the violent and malicious disposition of her husband's mother. However, she never complained, and every morning dressed herself up smart and went in to pay her respects to the old lady. Once, when Ta-cheng was ill, his mother abused Shan-hu for dressing so nicely, whereupon Shan-hu went back and changed her clothes. But even then Mrs. An was not satisfied, and began to tear her own hair with rage. Ta-cheng, who was a very filial son, at once gave his wife a beating, and this put an end to the scene. From that moment his mother hated her more than ever, and although she was everything that a daughter-in-law could be, would never exchange a word with her. Ta-cheng then treated her in much the same way, that his mother might see he would have nothing to do with her. Still the old lady wasn't pleased, and was always blaming Shan-hu for every trifle that occurred. "A wife," cried Ta-cheng, "is taken to wait upon her mother-in-law. This state of things hardly looks like the wife doing her duty." So he bade Shan-hu be gone, and sent an old maidservant to see her home. But when Shan-hu got outside the village gate, she burst into tears and said, "How can a girl who has failed in her duties as a wife ever dare to look her parents in the face? I had better die." Thereupon she drew a pair of scissors and stabbed herself in the throat, covering herself immediately with blood. The servant prevented any further mischief, and supported her to the house of her husband's aunt, who was a widow living by herself, and who made Shan Hu stay with her. The servant went back and told Tseng, and he bade her say nothing to any one, for fear his mother should hear of it. In a few days Shan Hu's wound was healed, and Tseng went off to ask his aunt to send her away. His aunt invited him in, but he declined, demanding loudly that Shan Hu should be turned out, and in a few moments Shan Hu herself came forth and inquired what she had done. Tseng said she had failed in her duty towards his mother, whereupon Shan Hu hung her head and made no answer, while tears of blood trickled from her eyes and stained her dress all over. Footnote. Such is the Chinese idiom for what we should call bitter tears. This phrase is constantly employed in the notices of the death of a parent sent round to friends and relatives. End of footnote. Tseng was much touched by this spectacle, and went away without saying any more. But before long his mother heard all about it, and hurrying off to the aunt's, began abusing her roundly. This the aunt would not stand, and said it was all the fault of her own bad temper, adding, "The girl has already left you, and has nothing more to do with the family. Miss Chen is staying with me, not your daughter-in-law, so you had better mind your own business." This made Mrs. An furious, but she was at a loss for an answer, and seeing that the aunt was firm, she went off home abashed and in tears. Shan Hu herself was very much upset, and determined to seek shelter elsewhere, finally taking up her abode with Mrs. An's elder sister, a lady of 60-odd years of age, whose son had died, leaving his wife and child to his mother's care. This Mrs. Yu was extremely fond of Shan Hu, and when she heard the facts of the case said it was all her sister's horrid disposition, and proposed to send Shan Hu back. The latter, however, would not hear of this, and they continued to live together like mother and daughter. Neither would Shan Hu accept the invitation of her two brothers to return home and marry someone else, but remained there with Mrs. Yu, earning enough to live upon by spinning and such work. Ever since Shan Hu had been sent away, Tseng's mother had been endeavoring to get him another wife, but the fame of her temper had spread far and wide, and no one would entertain her proposals. In 3 or 4 years, Tseng had grown up, and he was married first to a young lady named Tseng, whose temper turned out to be something fearful, and far more ungovernable even than her mother-in-law's. When the latter only looked angry, Tseng was already at the shrieking stage, and Tseng, being of a very meek disposition, dared not side with either. Thus it came about that Mrs. An began to be in mortal fear of Tseng, and whenever her daughter-in-law was in a rage, she would try and turn off her anger with a smile. She seemed never to be able to please Tseng, who in her turn worked her mother-in-law like a slave, Tseng himself not venturing to interfere, but only assisting his mother in washing the dishes and sweeping the floor. Mother and son would often go to some secluded spot, and there, in secret, tell their griefs to one another. But before long Mrs. An was stretched upon a sick-bed with nobody to attend her except Tseng. He watched her day and night without sleeping, until both eyes were red and inflamed, and then, when he went to summon the younger son to take his place, Tseng told him to leave the house. Tseng now went off to inform Mrs. Yu, hoping that she would come and assist, and he had hardly finished his tale of woe before Shan Hu walked in. In great confusion at seeing her, he would have left immediately, had not Shan held out her arms across the door, whereupon he bolted underneath them and escaped. He did not dare tell his mother, and shortly afterwards Mrs. Yu arrived, to the great joy of Tseng's mother, who made her stay in the house. Every day something nice was sent for Mrs. Yu, and even when she told the servants that there was no occasion for it, she having all she wanted at her sister's, the things still came as usual. However, she kept none of them for herself, but gave what came to the invalid, who gradually began to improve. Mrs. Yu's grandson also used to come by his mother's orders, and inquire after the sick lady's health, besides bringing a packet of cakes and so on for her. "Ah me!" cried Mrs. An, "what a good daughter-in-law you have got, to be sure! What have you done to her?" "What sort of a person was the one you sent away?" asked her sister in reply. "She wasn't as bad as someone I know of," said Mrs. An, "though not so good as yours." "When she was here you had but little to do," replied Mrs. Yu, "and when you were angry she took no notice of it. How was she not as good?" Mrs. An then burst into tears, and saying how sorry she was, asked if Shan Hu had married again, to which Mrs. Yü replied that she did not know, but would make inquiries. In a few more days the patient was quite well, and Mrs. Yü proposed to return. Her sister, however, begged her to stay, and declared she should die if she didn't. Mrs. Yü then advised that Cheng and his wife should live in a separate house, and Cheng spoke about it to his wife, but she would not agree, and abused both Cheng and his mother alike. It ended by Cheng giving up a large share of the property, and ultimately Tseng consented, and a deed of separation was drawn up. Mrs. Yü then went away, returning next day with a sedan chair to carry her sister back, and no sooner had the latter put her foot inside Mrs. Yü's door than she asked to see the daughter-in-law, whom she immediately began to praise very highly. "Ah," said Mrs. Yü, "she's a good girl, with her little faults like the rest of us, but your daughter-in-law is just as good, though you are not aware of it." "Alas," replied her sister, "I must have been as senseless as a statue not to have seen what she was." "I wonder what Shan Hu, whom you turned out of doors, says of you," rejoined Mrs. Yü. "Why, swears at me, of course," answered Mrs. An. "If you examine yourself honestly and find nothing which should make people swear at you, is it at all likely you would be sworn at?" asked Mrs. Yü. "Well, all people are fallible," replied the other, "and as I know she is not perfect, I conclude she would naturally swear at me." If a person has just cause for resentment, and yet does not indulge that resentment, such behavior should meet with a grateful acknowledgment; or if any one has just cause for leaving another, and yet does not do so, such behavior should entitle them to kind treatment. Now all the things that were sent when you were ill, and all the various little attentions, did not come from my daughter-in-law, but from yours." Mrs. An was amazed at hearing this, and asked for some explanation. Whereupon Mrs. Yü continued, "Shan Hu has been living here for a long time. Everything she sent to you was bought with money earned by her spinning, and that too continued late into the night." Mrs. An here burst into tears, and begged to be allowed to see Shan Hu, who came in at Mrs. Yü's summons, and threw herself on the ground at her mother-in-law's feet. Mrs. An was much abashed, and beat her head with shame, but Mrs. Yü made it all up between them, and they became mother and daughter as at first. In about 10 days they went home, and as their property was not enough to support them, Tseng had to work with his pen, while his wife did the same with her needle. Tseng was quite well off, but his brother would not apply to him, neither did he himself offer to help them. Tseng too, would have nothing to do with her sister-in-law, because she had been divorced, and Shan Hu, in her turn, knowing what Tseng Ku's temper was, made no great efforts to be friendly. So the two brothers lived apart, and when Tseng Ku was in one of her outrageous moods, all the others would stop their ears, till at length there was only her husband and the servants upon whom to vent her spleen. One day a maid-servant of hers committed suicide, and the father of the girl brought an action against Tseng Ku for having caused her death. Cheng went off to the mandarin's to take her place as defendant, but only got a good beating for his pains, as the magistrate insisted that Tseng Ku herself should appear and answer to the charge, in spite of all her friends could do. The consequence was she had her fingers squeezed until the flesh was entirely taken off. Footnote: an illegal form of punishment under the present dynasty, which authorizes only bambooing of 2 kinds, each of 5 degrees of severity. Banishment of 3 degrees of duration, transportation for life of 3 degrees of distance, and death of 2 kinds, namely by strangulation and decapitation. That torture is occasionally resorted to by the officers of the Chinese Empire is an indisputable fact. That it is commonly employed by the whole body of mandarins could only be averred by those who have not had the opportunities or the desire to discover the actual truth. End footnote. And the magistrate, being a grasping man, a very severe fine was inflicted as well. Cheng now had to mortgage his property before he could raise enough money to get Tseng Ku released, but before long the mortgagee threatened to foreclose, and he was obliged to enter into negotiations for the sale of it to an old gentleman of the village, named Jen. Now Mr. Jen, knowing that half the property had belonged to Cheng, said the deed of sale must be signed by the elder brother as well. However, when Cheng reached his house, the old man cried out, "I am Mr. An, M.A. Who is this Jen that he should buy my property?" Then Looking at Tseng, he added, "The filial piety of you and your wife has obtained for me in the realms below this interview." Upon which Tseng said, "O father, since you have this power, help my younger brother." "The unfilial son and the vixenish daughter-in-law," said the old man, "deserve no pity. Go home and quickly buy back our ancestral property." "We have barely enough to live on," replied Tseng. "Where, then, shall we find the necessary money?" "Beneath the crape myrtle tree," answered his father, "you will find a store of silver, which you may take and use for this purpose." Tseng would have questioned him further, but the old gentleman said no more, recovering consciousness shortly afterwards, without knowing a word of what had happened. Footnote: that is, old Mr. Gen's body had been possessed by the disembodied spirit of Tseng's father. Tseng went back and told his brother, who did not altogether believe the story. Tsang Ku, however, hurried off with a number of men, and had soon dug a hole 4 or 5 feet deep, at the bottom of which they found a quantity of brick and stones, but no gold. She then gave up the idea and returned home, Tseng having meanwhile warned his mother and wife not to go near the place while she was digging. When Tsang Ku left, Mrs. An went herself to have a look, and seeing only bricks and earth mingled together, she too retraced her steps. Shan Hu was the next to go, and she found the hole full of silver bullion, and then Tseng repaired to the spot and saw that there was no mistake about it. Not thinking it right to apply this heirloom to his own private use, he now summoned Tseng to share it, and having obtained twice as much as was necessary to redeem the estate, the brothers returned to their homes. Tseng and Tsang Ku opened their half together, when lo, the bag was full of tiles and rubbish. They at once suspected Tseng of deceiving them, and Tseng ran off to see how things were going at his brother's. He arrived just as Tseng was spreading the silver on the table, and with his mother and wife rejoicing over their acquisition, and when he had told them what had occurred, Tseng expressed much sympathy for him, and at once presented him with his own half of the treasure. Tseng was delighted, and paid off the mortgage on the land, feeling very grateful to his brother for such kindness. Tsang Ku, however, declared it was proof that Tseng had been cheating him, for how otherwise, argued she, can you understand a man sharing anything with another, and then resigning his own half? Tseng himself did not know what to think of it, but next day the mortgagee sent to say that the money paid in was all imitation silver, and that he was about to lay the case before the authorities. Husband and wife were greatly alarmed at this, and Tsang Ku exclaimed, "Well, I never thought your brother was as bad as this. He's simply trying to take your life." Tseng himself was in a terrible fright, and hurried off to the mortgagee to entreat for mercy. But as the latter was extremely angry and would hear of no compromise, Tseng was obliged to make over the property to him to dispose of himself. The money was then returned, and when he got home he found that 2 lumps had been cut through, showing merely an outside layer of silver, about as thick as an onion leaf, covering nothing but copper within. Tsang Ku and Tseng then agreed to keep the broken pieces themselves, but send the rest back to Tseng with a message, saying that they were deeply indebted to him for all his kindness, and that they had ventured to retain 2 of the lumps of silver, out of compliment to the giver. Also, that Tseng might consider himself the owner of the mortgaged land, which he could redeem or not as he pleased. Tseng, who did not perceive the intention in all this, refused to accept the land. However, Tseng entreated him to do so, and at last he consented. When he came to weigh the money, he found it was 5 ounces short, and therefore bade Shan Hu pawn something from her jewel box to make up the amount, with which he proceeded to pay off the mortgage. The mortgagee, suspecting it was the same money that had been offered him by Tseng, cut the pieces in halves, and saw that it was all silver of the purest quality. Accordingly, he accepted it in liquidation of his claim, and handed the mortgage back to Tseng. Meanwhile, Tseng had been expecting some catastrophe, but when he found that the mortgaged land had been redeemed, he did not know what to make of it. Tsang Ku thought that at the time of the digging, Tseng had concealed the genuine silver, and immediately rushed off to his house and began to revile them all around. Tseng now understood why they had sent him back the money, and Shan Hu laughed and said, "The property is safe. Why, then, this anger?" Thereupon she made Tseng hand over the deeds to Tsang Ku. One night, after this, Tseng's father appeared to him in a dream and reproached him, saying, Unfilial son, unfraternal brother, your hour is at hand. Wherefore usurp rights that do not belong to you? In the morning, Tseng told Tsang Ku of his dream, and proposed to return the property to his brother, but she only laughed at him for a fool. Just then, the eldest of his 2 sons, a boy of 7, died of smallpox, and this frightened Tsang Ku so that she agreed to restore the deeds. Ta Ch'êng would not accept them, and now the second child, a boy of 3, died also. Whereupon Tsang Ku seized the deeds and threw them into her brother-in-law's house. Spring was over, but the land was in a terribly neglected state, so Ta Ch'êng set to work and put it in order again. From this moment Tsang Ku was a changed woman towards her mother and sister-in-law, and when 6 months later Mrs. An died, she was so grieved that she refused to take any nourishment. "Alas," cried she, "that my mother-in-law has died thus early, and prevented me from waiting upon her. Heaven will not allow me to retrieve my past errors." Tsang Ku had 13 children, but as none of them lived, they were obliged to adopt one of Ta Ch'êng's, who, with his wife, lived to a good old age and had 3 sons, 2 of whom took their doctor's degree. People said this was a reward for filial piety and brotherly love. End of chapter 55.
Chapter 56 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in July 2016. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1 by Song-Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 56. Dr. Tseng's Dream. There was a Fokien gentleman named Tseng who had just taken his doctor's degree. One day he was out walking with several other recently elected doctors when they heard that at a temple hard by there lived an astrologer, and accordingly the party proceeded thither to get their fortunes told. They went in and sat down, and the astrologer made some very complimentary remarks to Tseng, at which he fanned himself and smiled, saying, "Have I any chance of ever wearing the dragon robes and the jade girdle?" Footnote, that is, of rising to the highest offices of state. End footnote. The astrologer immediately put on a serious face and replied that he would be a Secretary of State during 20 years of national tranquillity. Thereupon Tseng was much pleased and began to give himself greater airs than ever. A slight rain coming on, they sought shelter in the priest's quarters, where they found an old bonze, with sunken eyes and a big nose, sitting upon a mat. He took no notice of the strangers, who, after having bowed to him, stretched themselves upon the couches to chat, not forgetting to congratulate Tseng upon the destiny which had been foretold him. Tseng, too, seemed to think the thing was a matter of certainty, and mentioned the names of several friends he intended to advance, amongst others the old family butler. Roars of laughter greeted this announcement, mingled with the patter-patter of the increasing rain outside. Tseng then curled himself up for a nap, when suddenly in walked 2 officials bearing a commission under the Great Seal, appointing Tseng to the Grand Secretariat. As soon as Tseng understood their errand, he rushed off at once to pay his respects to the Emperor, who graciously detained him some time in conversation, and then issued instructions that the promotion and dismissals of all officers below the 3rd grade should be vested in Tseng alone. Footnote. Chinese official life is divided into 9 grades. End footnote. He was next presented with the dragon robes, the jade girdle, and a horse from the imperial stables, after which he performed the kowtow before His Majesty and took his leave. He then went home, but it was no longer the old home of his youth. Painted beams, carved pillars, and a general profusion of luxury and elegance made him wonder where on earth he was, until, nervously stroking his beard, he ventured to call out in a low tone. Immediately the responses of numberless attendants echoed through the place like thunder. Presents of costly food were sent to him by all the grandees, and his gate was absolutely blocked up by the crowds of retainers who were constantly coming and going. When privy councillors came to see him, he would rush out in haste to receive them. When under-secretaries of state visited him, he made them a polite bow, but to all below these he would hardly vouchsafe a word. The governor of Shanxi sent him 12 singing girls, 2 of whom, Ni and Fairy, he made his favourites. All day long he had nothing to do but find amusement as best he could, until he bethought himself that formerly a man named Wang had often assisted him with money. Thereupon he memorialized the throne and obtained official employment for him. Then he recollected that there was another man to whom he owed a long-standing grudge. He at once caused this man, who was in the government service, to be impeached and stripped of his rank and dignities. Thus he squared accounts with both. One day, when out in his chair, a drunken man bumped against one of his tablet-bearers. Footnote: the retinue of a high mandarin is composed as follows. First, gong-bearers, then bannermen, tablet-bearers, on which tablets are inscribed the titles of the official, a large red umbrella, mounted attendants, a box containing a change of clothes, bearers of regalia, a second gong, a small umbrella or sunshade, a large wooden fan, executioners, lictors from hell who wear tall hats, a mace, called a golden melon, bamboos for bambooing, incense-bearers, more attendants, and now the great man himself, followed by a bodyguard of soldiers and a few personal attendants, amounting in all to nearly 100 persons, many of whom are mere street rowdies or beggars, hired at a trifling outlay when required to join what might otherwise be an imposing procession. The scanty retinues of foreign officials in China still continue to excite the scorn of the populace, who love to compare the ragtag and bobtail magnificence of their own functionaries with the modest show even of His Britannic Majesty's minister at Pekin. Tseng had him seized and sent in to the mayor's yamen, where he died under the bamboo. Owners of land adjoining his would make him a present of the richest portions, fearing the consequences if they did not do so, and thus he became very wealthy, almost on a par with the state itself. By and by Ni and Fairy died, and Tseng was overwhelmed with grief. Suddenly he remembered that in former years he had seen a beautiful girl whom he wished to purchase as a concubine, but want of money had then prevented him from carrying out his intention. Now there was no longer that difficulty, and accordingly he sent off 2 trusty servants to get the girl by force. In a short time she arrived, when he found that she had grown more beautiful than ever, and so his cup of happiness was full. But years rolled on, and gradually his fellow officials became estranged, Tseng taking no notice of their behaviour, until at last one of them impeached him to the throne in a long and bitter memorial. Happily, however, the emperor still regarded him with favour, and for some time kept the memorial by him unanswered. Then followed a joint memorial from the whole of the Privy Council, including those who had once thronged his doors, and had falsely called him their dear father. The imperial rescript to this document was banishment to Yunnan. Footnote: a land journey of about 3 months, ending in a region which the Chinese have always regarded as semi-barbarous. His son, who was governor of Pingyang, being also implicated in his guilt. When Tseng heard the news, he was overcome with fear, but an armed guard was already at his gate, and the lictors were forcing their way into his innermost apartments. They tore off his robe and official hat, and bound him and his wife with cords. Then they collected together in the hall his gold, his silver, and bank-notes to the value of many 100,000 of taels. His pearls and jade and precious stones filled many bushel baskets. His curtains and screens and beds and other articles of furniture were brought out by thousands, while the swaddling clothes of his infant boy and the shoes of his little girl were lying littered about the steps. It was a sad sight for Tseng, but a worse blow was that of his concubine carried off almost lifeless before his eyes, himself not daring to utter a word. Then all the apartments, storerooms, and treasuries were sealed up, and, with a volley of curses, the soldiers bade Tseng begone, and proceeded to leave the place, dragging Tseng with them. The husband and wife prayed that they might be allowed some old cart, but this favour was denied them. After about 10 li, Tseng's wife could barely walk, her feet being swollen and sore. Tseng helped her along as best he could, but another 10 li reduced him to a state of abject fatigue. By and by they saw before them a great mountain, the summit of which was lost in the clouds, and, fearing they should be made to ascend it, Tseng and his wife stood still and began to weep. The lictors, however, clamoured round them and would permit of no rest. The sun was rapidly sinking, and there was no place at hand where they could obtain shelter for the night. So they continued on their weary way until about half-way up the hill, when his wife's strength was quite exhausted, and she sat down by the roadside. Tseng too halted to rest, in spite of the soldiers and their abuse, but they had hardly stopped a moment before down came a band of robbers upon them, each with a sharp knife in his hand. The soldiers immediately took to their heels, and Tseng fell on his knees before the robbers, saying, "I am a poor criminal going into banishment and have nothing to give you. I pray you spare my life." But the robbers sternly replied, "We are all the victims of your crimes, and now we want your wicked head." Then Tseng began to revile them, saying, "Dogs, though I am under sentence of banishment, I am still an officer of the state." But the robbers cursed him again, flourishing a sword over his neck, and the next thing he heard was the noise of his own head as it fell with a thud to the ground. At the same instant 2 devils stepped forward and seized him each by one hand, compelling him to go with them. After a little while they arrived at a great city where there was a hideously ugly king sitting upon a throne, judging between good and evil. Tseng crawled before him on his hands and knees to receive sentence, and the king, after turning over a few pages of his register, thundered out, "The punishment of a traitor who has brought misfortune on his country, the cauldron of boiling oil." To this 10,000 devils responded with a cry like a clap of thunder, and one huge monster led Tseng down alongside the cauldron, which was 7 feet in height, and surrounded on all sides by blazing fuel, so that it was of a glowing red heat. Tseng shrieked for mercy, but it was all up with him, for the devil seized him by the hair and the small of his back, and pitched him headlong in. Down he fell with a splash, and rose and sank with the bubbling of the oil, which ate through his flesh into his very vitals. He longed to die, but death would not come to him. After about half an hour's boiling, a devil took him out on a pitchfork and threw him down before the infernal king, who again consulted his notebook and said, "You relied on your position to treat others with contumely and injustice, for which you must suffer on the sword hill." Again he was led away by devils to a large hill thickly studded with sharp swords, their points upwards like the shoots of bamboo, with here and there the remains of many miserable wretches who had suffered before him. Tseng again cried for mercy and crouched upon the ground, but a devil bored into him with a poisoned awl until he screamed with pain. He was then seized and flung up high into the air, falling down right on the sword points to his most frightful agony. This was repeated several times until he was almost hacked to pieces. He was then brought once more before the king, who asked what was the amount of his peculations while on earth. Immediately an accountant came forward with an abacus, and said that the whole sum was 3,210,000 taels, whereupon the king replied, "Let him drink that amount." Forthwith the devils piled up a great heap of gold and silver, and, when they had melted it in a huge crucible, began pouring it into Tseng's mouth. The pain was excruciating as the molten metal ran down his throat into his vitals, but since in life he had never been able to get enough of the dross, it was determined he should feel no lack of it then. He was half a day drinking it, and then the king ordered him away to be born again as a woman in Kan-chou. A few steps brought them to a huge frame, where on an iron axle revolved the mighty wheel many hundred yojanas in circumference, and shining with a brilliant light. The devils flogged Tseng onto the wheel, and he shut his eyes as he stepped up. Then whiz! And away he went, feet foremost, round with the wheel, until he felt himself tumble off, and a cold thrill ran through him when he opened his eyes and found he was changed into a girl. He saw his father and mother in rags and tatters, and in one corner a beggar's bowl and a staff, and understand the calamity that had befallen him. Day after day he begged about the streets, and his inside rumbled for want of food. He had no clothes to his back. At 14 years of age he was sold to a gentleman as concubine, and then, though food and clothes were not wanting, he had to put up with the scoldings and floggings of the wife, who one day burnt him with a hot iron. Luckily the gentleman took a fancy to him and treated him well, which kindness Tseng repaid by an irreproachable fidelity. It happened, however, that on one occasion when they were chatting together, burglars broke into the house and killed the gentleman, Tseng having escaped by hiding himself under the bed. Thereupon he was immediately charged by the wife with murder, and on being taken before the authorities was sentenced to die the lingering death. This sentence was at once carried out with tortures more horrible than any in all the courts of purgatory, in the middle of which Tseng heard one of his companions call out, "Hullo there, you've got the nightmare." Tseng got up and rubbed his eyes, and his friends said, "It's quite late in the day, and we're all very hungry." But the old priest smiled and asked him if the prophecy as to his future rank was true or not. Tseng bowed and begged him to explain, whereupon the old priest said, "For those who cultivate virtue, a lily will grow up even in the fiery pit." Tseng had gone thither full of pride and vainglory. He went home an altered man. From that day he thought no more of becoming a Secretary of State, but retired into the hills, and I know not what became of him after that. End of chapter 56.
Chapter 57 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J. Olpecker. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song-Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 57. The Country of the Cannibals. At Chao Chao there lived a man named Su, who gained his living by trading across the sea. On one occasion he was carried far out of his course by a violent tempest, and reached a country of high hills and dense jungle, where, after making fast his boat and taking provisions with him, he landed, hoping to meet with some of the inhabitants. He then saw that the rocks were covered with large holes, like the cells of bees, and, hearing the sound of voices from within, he stopped in front of one of them and peeped in. To his infinite horror, he beheld two hideous beings with thick rows of horrid fangs, and eyes that glared like lamps, engaged in tearing to pieces and devouring some raw deer's flesh. And, turning round, he would have fled instantly from the spot, had not the cave-men already espied him, and, leaving their food, they seized him and dragged him in. Thereupon ensued a chattering between them, resembling the noise of birds or beasts, and they proceeded to pull off Hsü's clothes, as if about to eat him. But Hsü, who was frightened almost to death, offered them the food he had in his wallet, which they ate up with great relish, and looked inside for more. Hsü waved his hand to shew it was all finished, and then they angrily seized him again, at which he cried out, "I have a saucepan in my boat, and can cook you some." The cave-men did not understand what he said, but by dint of gesticulating freely, they at length seemed to have an idea of what he meant, and, having taken him down to the shore to fetch the saucepan, they returned with him to the cave, where he lighted a fire and cooked the remainder of the deer, with the flavour of which they appeared to be mightily pleased. At night they rolled a big stone to the mouth of the cave, fearing lest he should try to escape, and Hsü himself lay down at a distance from them, in doubt as to whether his life would be spared. At daybreak the cave-men went out, leaving the entrance blocked, and by came back with a deer, which they gave to Hsü to cook. Hsü flayed the carcass, and from a remote corner of the cave took some water and prepared a large quantity, which was no sooner ready than several other cave-men arrived to join in the feast. When they had finished all there was, they made signs that Hsü's saucepan was too small, and 3 or 4 days afterwards they brought him a large one of the same shape as those in common use amongst men, subsequently furnishing him with constant supplies of wolf and deer, of which they always invited him to partake. By degrees they began to treat him kindly, and not to shut him up when they went out, and Hsü, too, gradually learnt to understand and even to speak a little of their language, which pleased them so much that they finally gave him a cave woman for his wife. Hsü was horribly afraid of her, but as she treated him with great consideration, always reserving titbits of food for him, they lived very happily together. One day all the cave people got up early in the morning, and having adorned themselves with strings of fine pearls, they went forth as if to meet some honoured guest, giving orders to Hsü to cook an extra quantity of meat that day. "It is the birthday of our king," said Hsü's wife to him, and then, running out, she informed the other cave people that her husband had no pearls. So each gave 5 from his own string, and Hsü's wife added 10 to these, making in all 50, which she threaded on a hempen fibre and hung around his neck, each pearl being worth over 100 ounces of silver. Then they went away, and as soon as Hsü had finished his cooking, his wife appeared, and invited him to come and receive the king. So off they went to a huge cavern covering about a mow of ground, in which was a huge stone, smoothed away at the top like a table, with stone seats at the four sides. At the upper end was a dais, over which was spread a leopard skin, the other seats having only deer skins. And within the cavern 20 or 30 cave-men ranged themselves on the seats. After a short interval, a great wind began to stir up the dust, and they all rushed out to a creature very much resembling themselves, which hurried into the cave, and, squatting down cross-legged, cocked its head, and looked about like a cormorant. The other cave-men then filed in, and took up their positions right and left of the dais, where they stood gazing up at the king, with their arms folded before them in the form of a cross. The king counted them one by one, and asked if they were all present, and when they replied in the affirmative, he looked at Su, and inquired who he was. Thereupon Su's wife stepped forward, and said he was her husband, and the others all loudly extolled his skill in cookery, 2 of them running out and bringing back some cooked meat, which they set before the king. His Majesty swallowed it by handfuls, and found it so nice that he gave orders to be supplied regularly, and then, turning to Su, he asked him why his string of beads was so short. "He has but recently arrived among us," replied the caveman, "and hasn't got a complete set." Upon which the king drew 10 pearls from the string round his own neck, and bestowed them upon Su. Each was as big as the top of one's finger, and as round as a bullet. And Su's wife threaded them for him, and hung them round his neck. Su himself crossed his arms and thanked the king in the language of the country, after which his Majesty went off in a gust of wind, as rapidly as a bird can fly, and the cavemen sat down and finished what was left of the banquet. 4 years afterwards, Su's wife gave birth to a triplet of 2 boys and 1 girl, all of whom were ordinary human beings, and not at all like the mother, at which the other cave people were delighted, and would often play with them and caress them. 3 years passed away, and the children could walk about, after which their father taught them to speak his own tongue, and in their early babblings their human origin was manifested. The boys, as mere children, could climb about on the mountains as easily as though walking upon a level road, and between them and their father there grew up a mutual feeling of attachment. One day the mother had gone out with the girl and 1 of the boys, and was absent for a long time. A strong north wind was blowing, and Su, filled with thoughts of his old home, led his other son down with him to the beach, where lay the boat in which he had formerly reached this country. He then proposed to the boy that they should go away together, and, having explained to him that they could not inform his mother, father and son stepped on board, and, after a voyage of only 24 hours, arrived safely at Chao Chao. On reaching home, Su found that his wife had married again, so he sold 2 of his pearls for an enormous sum of money, and set up a splendid establishment. His son was called Piao, and at 14 or 15 years of age the boy could lift a weight of 3,000 catties, or 4,000 pounds. He was extremely fond of athletics of all kinds, and thus attracted the notice of the commander-in-chief, who gave him a commission as a sub-lieutenant. Just at that time there happened to be some trouble on the frontier, and young Piao, having covered himself with glory, was made a colonel at the age of 18. About that time another merchant was driven by stress of weather to the country of the cavemen, and had hardly stepped ashore before he observed a young man whom he knew at once to be of Chinese origin. The young man asked him whence he came, and finally took him into a cave hid away in a dark valley and concealed by the dense jungle. There he bade him remain, and in a little while he returned with some deer's flesh, which he gave the merchant to eat, saying at the same time that his own father was a Chow man. The merchant now knew that the young man was Su's son, he himself being acquainted with Su as a trader in the same line of business. "Why, he's an old friend of mine," cried the latter. "His other son is now a colonel." The young man did not know what was meant by a colonel, so the merchant told him it was the title of a Chinese mandarin. "And what is a mandarin?" asked the youth. "A mandarin," replied the merchant, "is one who goes out with a chair and horses, who at home sits upon a dais in the hall, whose summons is answered by 100 voices, who is looked at only with sidelong eyes, and in whose presence all people stand aslant. This is to be a mandarin." The young man was deeply touched at this recital, and at length the merchant said to him, "Since your honored father is at Chow, why do you remain here?" "Indeed," replied the youth, "I have often indulged the same feeling, but my mother is not a Chinese woman, and apart from the difference of her language and appearance, I fear that if the other cave people found it out, they would do us some mischief." He then took his leave, being in rather a disturbed state of mind, and bade the merchant wait until the wind should prove favorable, when he promised to come and see him off, and charge him with a letter to his father and brother. 6 months the merchant remained in that cave, occasionally taking a peep at the cave people passing backwards and forwards, but not daring to leave his retreat. As soon as the monsoon set in, the young man arrived and urged him to hurry away, begging him also not to forget the letter to his father. So the merchant sailed away, and soon reached Chow, where he visited the colonel and told him the whole story. Piao was much affected, and wished to go in search of those members of the family, but his father feared the dangers he would encounter, and advised him not to think of such a thing. However, Piao was not to be deterred, and having imparted his scheme to the commander-in-chief, he took with him 2 soldiers and set off. Adverse winds prevailed at that time, and they beat about for half a moon, until they were out of sight of all land, could not set a foot before them, and had completely lost their reckoning. Just then a mighty sea arose, and capsized their boat, tossing Piao into the water, where he floated about for some time at the will of the waves, until suddenly somebody dragged him out and carried him into a house. Then he saw that his rescuer was to all appearances a cave-man, and accordingly he addressed him in the cave people's language, and told him whither he himself was bound. "It is my native place," replied the cave-man, in astonishment. "But you will excuse my saying that you are now 8,000 li out of your course. This is the way to the country of the poisonous dragons, and not your route at all." He then went off to find a boat for Piao, and, himself swimming in the water behind, pushed it along like an arrow from a bow, so quickly that by the next day they had traversed the whole distance. On the shore Piao observed a young man walking up and down, and evidently watching him, and, knowing that no human beings dwelt there, he guessed at once that he was his brother. Approaching more closely, he saw that he was right, and seizing the young man's hand, he asked after his mother and sister. On hearing that they were well, he would have gone directly to see them, but the younger one begged him not to do so, and ran away himself to fetch them. Meanwhile, Piao turned to thank the cave-man who had brought him there, but he too had disappeared. In a few minutes his mother and sister arrived, and on seeing Piao they could not restrain their tears. Piao then laid his scheme before them, and when they said they feared people would ill-treat them, he replied, "In China I hold a high position, and people will not dare to shew you disrespect." Thus they determined to go. The wind, however, was against them, and mother and son were at a loss what to do, when suddenly the sail bellied out towards the south, and a rustling sound was heard. "Heaven helps us, my mother," cried Piao, full of joy, and, hurrying on board at once, in 3 days they had reached their destination. As they landed, the people fled right and left in fear, Piao having divided his own clothes amongst the party. And when they arrived at the house, and his mother saw Tsu, she began to rate him soundly for running away without her. Tsu hastened to acknowledge his error, and then all the family and servants were introduced to her, each one being in mortal dread of such a singular personage. Piao now bade his mother learn to talk Chinese, and gave her any quantity of fine clothes and rich meats, to the infinite delight of the old lady. She and her daughter both dressed in man's clothes, and by the end of a few months were able to understand what was said to them. The brother, named Pao, or leopard, and the sister, Ye, or night, were both clever enough and immensely strong into the bargain. Piao was ashamed that Pao could not read, and set to work to teach him, and the youngster was so quick that he learnt the sacred books and histories by merely reading them once over. However, he would not enter upon a literary career, loving better to draw a strong bow or ride a spirited horse, and finally taking the highest military degree. He married the daughter of a post-captain, but his sister had some trouble in getting a husband because of her being the child of a cave-woman. At length a sergeant named Huan, who was under her brother's command, was forced to take her as his wife. She could draw 100 catty bow, and shoot birds at 100 paces without ever missing. Whenever Huan went to battle, she went with him, and his subsequent rise to high rank was chiefly due to her. At 34 years of age, Pao got a command, and in his great battles his mother, clad in armor and grasping a spear, would fight by his side, to the terror of all their adversaries, and when he himself received the dignity of a hereditary title, he memorialized the throne to grant his mother the title of lady. End of chapter 57. Recording by J. Olpecker.
Chapter 58 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song-Ling Pu, translated by Herbert A. Giles. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jane Dever. Chapter 58. Football on the Tung-t'ing Lake. Wang Shi-hsiu was a native of Liu Chao, and such a lusty fellow that he could pick up a stone mortar. Father and son were both good football players, but when the former was about 40 years of age he was drowned while crossing the money pool. Some 8 or 9 years later our hero happened to be on his way to Hunan, and anchoring in the Tung-t'ing Lake, watching the moon rising in the east and illuminating the water into a bright sheet of light. While he was thus engaged, lo! From out of the lake emerged 5 men, bringing with them a large mat, which they spread on the surface of the water so as to cover about 6 yards square. Wine and food were then arranged upon it, and Wang heard the sound of the dishes knocking together, but it was a dull, soft sound, not at all like that of ordinary crockery. 3 of the men sat down on the mat, and the other waited upon them. One of the former was dressed in yellow, the other 2 in white, and each wore a black turban. Their demeanour as they sat there side by side was grave and dignified. In appearance they resembled 3 of the ancients, but by the fitful beams of the moon Wang was unable to see very clearly what they were like. The attendants wore black serge dresses, and one of them seemed to be a boy, while the other was many years older. Wang now heard the man in yellow dress say, "This is truly a fine moonlight night for a drinking bout," to which one of his companions replied, "It quite reminds me of the night when Prince Huang Li feasted at Pear Blossom Island." The 3 then pledged each other in bumping goblets, talking all the time in such a low tone that Wang could not hear what they were saying. The boatmen kept themselves concealed, crouching down at the bottom of the boat, but Wang looked hard at the attendants, the elder of whom bore a striking resemblance to his father, though he spoke in quite a different tone of voice. When it was drawing towards midnight, one of them proposed a game at ball, and in a moment the boy disappeared in the water, to return immediately with a huge ball, quite an armful in fact, apparently full of quicksilver, and lustrous within and without. All now rose up, and the man in yellow dress bade the old attendant join them in the game. The ball was kicked up some 10 or 15 feet in the air, and was quite dazzling in its brilliancy; but once when it had gone up with a whish, it fell at some distance off, right in the very middle of Wang's boat. The occasion was irresistible, and Wang, exerting all his strength, kicked the ball with all his might. It seemed unusually light and soft to the touch, and his foot broke right through. Away went the ball to a good height, pouring forth a stream of light like a rainbow from the hole Wang had made, and making as it fell a curve like that of a comet rushing across the sky. Down it glided into the water, where it fizzed a moment and then went out. "Ho there!" cried one of the players in anger. "What living creature is that who dares thus to interrupt our sport?" "Well kicked indeed," said the old man. "That's a favourite drop kick of my own." At this, one of the two in white clothes began to abuse him, saying, "What, you old baggage! When we are all so annoyed in this manner, are you to come forward and make a joke of it? Go at once with the boy and bring back to us this practical joker, or your own back will have a taste of the stick." Wang was of course unable to flee. However, he was not a bit afraid, and grasping a sword, stood there in the middle of the boat. In a moment the old man and boy arrived, also armed, and then Wang knew that the former was really his father, and called out to him at once, "Father, I am your son." The old man was greatly alarmed, but father and son forgot their troubles in the joy of meeting once again. Meanwhile the boy went back, and Wang's father bid him hide, or they would all be lost. The words were hardly out of his mouth when the three men jumped on board the boat. Their faces were black as pitch, their eyes as big as pomegranates, and they at once proceeded to seize the old man. Wang struggled hard with them, and managing to get the boat free from her moorings, he seized his sword and cut off one of his adversary's arms. The arm dropped down, and the man in yellow dress ran away, whereupon one of those in white rushed at Wang, who immediately cut off his head, and he fell into the water with a splash, at which the third disappeared. Wang and his father were now anxious to get away, when suddenly a great mouth arose from the lake, as big and as deep as a well, and against which they could hear the noise of water when it struck. This mouth blew forth a violent gust of wind, and in a moment the waves were mountains high, and all the boats on the lake were tossing about. The boatmen were terrified, but Wang seized one of two huge stones there were on board for use as anchors, about 130 pounds in weight, and threw it into the water, which immediately began to subside. And then he threw in the other one, upon which the wind dropped and the lake became calm again. Wang thought his father was a disembodied spirit, but the old man said, "I never died. There were 19 of us drowned in the river, all of whom were eaten by the fish goblins except myself. I was saved because I could play football. Those you saw got into trouble with the Dragon King, and were sent here. They were all marine creatures, and the ball they were playing with was a fish bladder." Father and son were overjoyed at meeting again, and at once proceeded on their way. In the morning they found in the boat a huge fin, the arm that Wang had cut off the night before. End of chapter 58.
Chapter 59 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Landu. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 59. The Thunder God. Lei Yunhao and Xiaoping Zhu lived as boys in the same village, and when they grew up read with the same tutor, becoming the firmest of friends. Xia was a clever fellow, and had acquired some reputation even at the early age of 10. Lei was not a bit envious, but rather looked up to him, and Xia in return helped his friend very much with his studies, so that he too made considerable progress. This increased Xia's fame, though try as he would, he could never succeed at the public examinations, and by he sickened and died. His family was so poor they could not find money for his burial, whereupon Lê came forward and paid all expenses, besides taking care of his widow and children. Every peck or bushel he would share with them, the widow trusting entirely to his support, and thus he acquired a good name in the village. Though not being a rich man himself, he soon ran through all his own property. "Alas," cried he, "where talents like she has failed, can I expect to succeed? Wealth and rank are matters of destiny, and my present career will only end by my dying like a dog in a ditch. I must try something else." So he gave up book learning and went into trade, and in 6 months he had a trifle of money in hand. One day when he was resting at an inn in Nanking, he saw a great big fellow walk in and seat himself at no great distance, in a very melancholy mood. Lê asked him if he was hungry, and on receiving no answer, pushed some food over towards him. The stranger immediately set to feeding himself by handfuls, and in no time the whole had disappeared. Lê ordered another supply, but that was quickly disposed of in like manner. And then he told the landlord to bring a shoulder of pork and a quantity of boiled dumplings. Thus, after eating enough for half a dozen, his appetite was appeased, and he turned to thank his benefactor, saying, "For 3 years I haven't had such a meal." "And why should a fine fellow like you be in such a state of destitution?" inquired Lê, to which the other only replied, "The judgments of heaven may not be discussed." Being asked where he lived, the stranger replied, "On land I have no home, on the water no boat, at dawn in the village, at night in the city." Lê then prepared to depart, but his friend would not leave him, declaring that he was in imminent danger, and that he could not forget the late kindness Lê had shown him. So they went along together, and on the way Lê invited the other to eat with him, but this he refused, saying that he only took food occasionally. Lê marvelled more than ever at this, and next day when they were on the river, a great storm arose and capsized all their boats, Lê himself being thrown into the water with the others. Suddenly the gale abated, and the stranger bore Lê on his back to another boat, plunging at once into the water and bringing back the lost vessel, upon which he placed Lê and bade him remain quietly there. He then returned once more, this time carrying in his arms a part of the cargo, which he replaced in the vessel, and so he went on until it was all restored. Lê thanked him, saying, "It was enough to save my life, but you have added to this the restoration of my goods." Nothing, in fact, had been lost, and now Lê began to regard the stranger as something more than human. The latter here wished to take his leave, but Lê pressed him so much to stay that at last he consented to remain. Then Lê remarked that after all he had lost a gold pin, and immediately the stranger plunged into the water again, rising at length to the surface with the missing article in his mouth, and presenting it to Lê with the remark that he was delighted to be able to fulfill his commands. The people on the river were all much astonished at what they saw. Meanwhile, Lê went home with his friend, and there they lived together, the big man only eating once in 10 or 12 days, but then displaying an enormous appetite. One day he spoke of going away, to which Lê would by no means consent, and as it was just then about to rain and thunder, he asked him to tell him what the clouds were like, and what thunder was, also how he could get up to the sky and have a look, so as to set his mind at rest on the subject. "Would you like to have a ramble among the clouds?" asked the stranger, as Lê was lying down to take a nap, on awaking from which he felt himself spinning along through the air, and not at all as if he was lying on a bed. Opening his eyes, he saw he was among the clouds, and around him was a fleecy atmosphere. Jumping up in great alarm, he felt giddy as if he had been at sea, and underneath his feet he found a soft, yielding substance, unlike the earth. Above him were the stars, and this made him think he was dreaming. But looking up he saw that they were set in the sky like seeds in the cup of a lily, varying from the size of the biggest bowl to that of a small basin. On raising his hand he discovered that the large stars were all tightly fixed, but he managed to pick a small one, which he concealed in his sleeve, and then, parting the clouds beneath him, he looked through and saw the sea glittering like silver below. Large cities appeared no bigger than beans. Just at this moment, however, he bethought himself that if his foot were to slip, what a tremendous fall he would have. He now beheld 2 dragons writhing their way along, and drawing a cart with a huge vat in it, each movement of their tails sounded like the crack of a bullock driver's whip. The vat was full of water, and numbers of men were employed in ladling it out and sprinkling it on the clouds. These men were astonished at seeing Lê. However, a big fellow among them called out, "All right, he's my friend," and then they gave him a ladle to help them throw the water out. Now it happened to be a very dry season, And when Lê got hold of the ladle, he took good care to throw the water so that it should all fall on and around his own home. The stranger then told him that he was the god of thunder, and that he had just returned from a 3 years' punishment inflicted on him in consequence of some neglect of his in the matter of rain. He added that they must now part, and taking the long rope which had been used as reins for the cart, bade Lê grip it tightly, that he might be let down to earth. Lê was afraid of this, but on being told there was no danger, he did so, and in a moment, whish, away he went and found himself safe and sound on terra firma. He discovered that he had descended outside his native village, and then the rope was drawn up into the clouds, and he saw it no more. The drought had been excessive. For 3 or 4 miles round very little rain had fallen, though in Lé's own village the watercourses were all full. On reaching home he took the star out of his sleeve and put it on the table. It was dull, looking like an ordinary stone, but at night it became very brilliant and lighted up the whole house. This made him value it highly, and he stored it carefully away, bringing it out only when he had guests, to light them at their wine. It was always thus dazzlingly bright, until one evening when his wife was sitting with him doing her hair, the star began to diminish in brilliancy, and to flit about like a firefly. Mrs. Lê sat gaping with astonishment, when all of a sudden it flitted into her mouth and ran down her throat. She tried to cough it up, but couldn't, to the very amazement of her husband. That night Lê dreamt that his old friend Xia appeared before him and said, "I am the Shao Wei star. Your friendship is still cherished by me, and now you have brought me back from the sky. Truly our destinies are knitted together, and I will repay your kindness by becoming your son." Now Lê was 30 years of age, but without sons. However, after this dream his wife bore him a male child, and they called his name Star. He was extraordinarily clever, and at 16 years of age took his master's degree. End of chapter 59. Recording by Michael Landu. Chapter 60 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Landu. Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song Ling Pu. Translated by Herbert Allen Giles. Chapter 60. The Gambler's Talisman. A Taoist priest called Han lived at the Tianxi Temple in our district city. His knowledge of the black art was very extensive, and the neighbors all regarded him as an immortal. My late father was on intimate terms with him, and whenever he went into the city, invariably paid him a visit. One day, on such an occasion, he was proceeding thither in company with my late uncle, when suddenly they met Han on the road. Handing them the key of the door, he begged them to go on and wait a while for him, promising to be there shortly himself. Following out these instructions, they repaired to the temple, but on unlocking the door, there was Han sitting inside, a feat which he subsequently performed several times. Now, a relative of mine, who was terribly given to gambling, also knew this priest, having been introduced to him by my father. And once this relative, meeting with a Buddhist priest from the Tianfo temple, addicted like himself to the vice of gambling, played with him until he had lost everything, even going so far as to pledge the whole of his property, which he lost in a single night. Happening to call in upon Han as he was going back, the latter noticed his exceedingly dejected appearance, and the rambling answers he gave, and asked him what was the matter. On hearing the story of his losses, Han only laughed and said, "That's what always overtakes the gambler, sooner or later. If, however, you will break yourself of the habit, I will get your money back for you." "Ah," cried the other, "if you will only do that, you may break my head with a pestle when you catch me gambling again." So Han gave him a talismanic formula, written out on a piece of paper, to put in his girdle, bidding him only win back what he had lost, and not attempt to get a fraction more. He also handed him 1,000 cash on condition that his sum should be repaid from his winnings, and off went my relative delighted. The Buddhist, however, turned up his nose at the smallness of his means, and said it wasn't worth his while to stake so little, but at last he was persuaded into having one throw for the whole lot. They then began, the priest leading off with a fair throw, to which his opponent replied by a better, whereupon the priest doubled his stake, and my relative one again, going on and on until the latter's good luck had brought him back all that he had previously lost. He thought, however, that he couldn't do better than just win a few more strings of cash, and accordingly went on. But gradually his luck turned, and on looking into his girdle he found that the talisman was gone. In a great fright he jumped up and went off with his winnings to the temple, where he reckoned up that after deducting Han's loan, and adding what he had lost towards the end, he had exactly the amount originally his. With shame in his face he turned to thank Han, mentioning at the same time the loss of the talisman, at which Han only laughed and said, "That has got back before you. I told you not to be over-greedy, and as you didn't heed me, I took the talisman away." End of chapter 60. Recording by Michael Landu.
Chapter 61 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song-Ling Pu, translated by Herbert A. Giles. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jane Dever. Chapter 61. The Husband Punished. Tseng of Wentang was a young fellow of some literary reputation, who lived next door to a Mr. Chen, their studios being separated only by a low wall. One evening Chang was crossing a piece of waste ground when he heard a young girl crying among some pine trees hard by. He approached, and saw a girdle hanging from one of the branches, as if its owner was just on the point of hanging herself. Chen asked her what was the matter, and then she brushed away her tears and said, "My mother has gone away, and left me in charge of my brother-in-law. But he's a scamp, and won't continue to take care of me, and now there is nothing left for me but to die." Hereupon the girl began to cry again, and Chen untied the girdle and bade her go and find herself a husband, to which she said there was very little chance of that, and then Chen offered to take her to his own home, an offer which she very gladly accepted. Soon after they arrived, his neighbour Ching thought he heard a noise, and jumped over the wall to have a peep, when lo and behold, at the door of Chen's house stood this young lady, who immediately ran away into the garden on seeing Ching. The two young men pursued her, but without success, and were obliged to return each to his own room, Ching being greatly astonished to find the same girl now standing at his door. On addressing the young lady, she told him that his neighbour's destiny was too poor a one for her, and that she came from Shantung, and that her name was Shi Asia. She finally agreed to take up her residence with Ching, but after a few days, finding that a great number of his friends were constantly calling, she declared it was too noisy a place for her, and that she would only visit him in the evening. This she continued to do for a few days, telling him in reply to his inquiries that her home was not very far off. One evening, however, she remarked that their present liaison was not very creditable to either, that her father was a mandarin on the western frontier, and that she was about to set out with her mother to join him, begging him meanwhile to make a formal request for the celebration of their nuptials, in order to prevent them from being thus separated. She further said that they started in 10 days or so, and then Ching began to reflect that if he married her she would have to take her place in the family, and that would make his first wife jealous. So he determined to get rid of the latter, and when she came in he began to abuse her right and left. His wife bore it as long as she could, but at length cried out it were better she should die, upon which Ching advised her not to bring trouble on them all like that, but to go back to her own home. He then drove her away, his wife asking all the time what she had done to be sent away like this, after 10 years of blameless life with him. Ching, however, paid no heed to her entreaties, and when he had got rid of her he set to work at once to get the house whitewashed and made generally clean. himself being on the tiptoe of expectation for the arrival of Miss Asia. But he waited and waited, and no Asia came. She seemed gone like a stone dropped into the sea. Meanwhile, emissaries came from his late wife's family begging him to take her back, and when he flatly refused, she married a gentleman of position named Hsia, whose property adjoined Ching's, and who had long been at feud with him in consequence, as is usual in such cases. This made Ching furious, but he still hoped that Asia would come, and tried to console himself in this way. Yet more than a year passed away, and still no signs of her, until one day, at the festival of the sea spirits, he saw among the crowds of girls passing in and out one who very much resembled Asia. Ching moved towards her, following her as she threaded her way through the crowd as far as the temple gate, where he lost sight of her altogether, to his great mortification and regret. Another 6 months passed away, when one day he met a young lady dressed in red, accompanied by an old man-servant, and riding on a black mule. It was Asia, so he asked the old man the name of his young mistress, and learnt from him that she was the second wife of a gentleman named Tseng, having been married to him about a fortnight previously. Ching now thought she could not be Asia, but just then the young lady, hearing them talking, turned her head, and Ching saw that he was right. And now, finding that she had actually married another man, he was overwhelmed with rage, and cried out in a loud voice, "Asia, Asia, why did you break faith?" The servant here objected to his mistress being thus addressed by a stranger, and was squaring up to Ching, when Asia bade him desist, and raising her veil, replied, "And you, faithless one, how do you dare meet my gaze?" "You are the faithless one," said Ching, "not I." "To be faithless to your wife is worse than being faithless to me," rejoined Asia. "If you behave like that to her, how should I have been treated at your hand? Because of the fair fame of your ancestors and the honours gained by them, I was willing to ally myself with you. But now that you have discarded your wife, your thread of official advancement has been cut short in the realms below, and Mr. Chen is to take the place that should have been yours at the head of the examination list. As for myself, I am now part of the Chang family. Think no more of me." Ching hung his head and could make no reply, and Asia whipped up her mule and disappeared from his sight, leaving him to return home disconsolate. At the forthcoming examination, everything turned out as she had predicted. Mr. Chen was at the top of the list, and he himself was thrown out. It was clear that his luck was gone. At 40 he had no wife, and was so poor that he was glad to pick up a meal where he could. One day he called on Mr. Chang, who treated him well and kept him there for the night. And while there, Chang's second wife saw him and asked her husband if his guest's name was Ching. "It is," said he. "How could you guess that?" "Well," replied she, "before I married you, I took refuge in his house, and he was then very kind to me. Although he has now sunk low, yet his ancestors' influence on the family fortunes is not yet exhausted. Besides, he is an old acquaintance of yours, and you should try and do something for him." Chang consented, and having first given him a new suit of clothes, kept him in the house several days. At night a slave girl came to him with 20 ounces of silver for him, and Mrs. Chang, who was outside the window, said, "This is a trifling return for your past kindness to me. Go and get yourself a good wife. The family luck is not yet exhausted, but will descend to your sons and grandchildren. Do not behave like this again, and so shorten your term of life." Ching thanked her and went home, using 10 ounces of silver to procure a concubine from a neighbouring family, who was very ugly and ill-tempered. However, she bore him a son, and he by and by graduated as doctor. Mr. Chang became vice president of the Board of Civil Office, and at his death Asia attended the funeral. But when they opened her chair on its return home, she was gone, and then people knew for the first time that she was not mortal flesh and blood. Alas, for the perversity of mankind, rejecting the old and craving for the new, and then when they come back to the familiar nest, the birds have all flown. Thus does heaven punish such people. End of chapter 61. Chapter 62 of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song-Ling Pu, translated by Herbert A. Giles. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jane Dever. Chapter 62. The Marriage Lottery. A certain laborer's son, named Ma Tianzheng, lost his wife when he was only about 20 years of age, and was too poor to take another. One day, when out hoeing in the fields, he beheld a nice-looking young lady leave a path and come tripping across the furrows towards him. Her face was well painted, and she had altogether such a refined look that Ma concluded she must have lost her way, and began to make some playful remarks in consequence. "You go along home," cried the young lady, "and I'll be with you by and by." Ma doubted this rather extraordinary promise, but she bowed and declared she would not break her word. And then Ma went off, telling her that his front door faced the north, etc., etc. In the evening the young lady arrived, and then Ma saw that her hands and face were covered with fine hair, which made him suspect at once she was a fox. She did not deny the accusation, and accordingly Ma said to her, "If you really are one of those wonderful creatures, you will be able to get me anything I want, and I should be much obliged if you would begin by giving me some money to relieve my poverty." The young lady said she would, and next evening, when she came again, Ma asked her where the money was. "Dear me," replied she, "I quite forgot it." When she was going away, Ma reminded her of what he wanted, but on the following evening she made precisely the same excuse, promising to bring it another day. A few nights afterwards Ma asked her once more for the money, and then she drew from her sleeve 2 pieces of silver, each weighing about 5 or 6 ounces. They were both of fine quality, with turned up edges, and Ma was very pleased and stored them away in a cupboard. Some months after this, he happened to require some money for use, and took out these pieces, but the person to whom he showed them said they were only pewter, and easily bit off a portion of one of them with his teeth. Ma was much alarmed, and put the pieces away directly, taking the opportunity when evening came of abusing the young lady roundly. "It's all your bad luck," retorted she. "Real gold would be too much for your inferior destiny." There was an end of that, but Ma went on to say, "I always heard that fox girls were of surpassing beauty. How is it you are not?" "Oh," replied the young lady, "we always adapt ourselves to our company. Now you haven't the luck of an ounce of silver to call your own, and what would you do, for instance, with a beautiful princess? My beauty may not be good enough for the aristocracy, but among your big-footed burden-carrying rustics, why, it may safely be called surpassing." A few months passed away, and then one day the young lady came and gave Ma 3 ounces of silver, saying, "You have often asked me for money, but in consequence of your weak luck I have always refrained from giving you any. Now, however, your marriage is at hand, and I here give you the cost of a wife, which you may also regard as a parting gift from me." Ma replied that he wasn't engaged. To which the young lady answered that in a few days a go-between would visit him to arrange the affair. "And what will she be like?" asked Ma. "Why, as your aspirations are for surpassing beauty," replied the young lady, "of course she will be possessed of surpassing beauty." "I hardly expect that," said Ma. "At any rate, 3 ounces of silver will not be enough to get a wife." "Marriages," explained the young lady, "are made in the moon. Mortals have nothing to do with them." "And why must you be going away like this?" inquired Ma. "Because," answered she, "we go on shilly-shallying from day to day, and month to month, and nothing ever comes of it. I had better get you another wife, and have done with you." Then when morning came she departed, giving Ma a pinch of yellow powder, saying, "In case you are ill after we are separated, this will cure you." Next day, sure enough, a go-between did come, and Ma at once asked what the proposed bride was like, to which the former replied that she was very passable looking. 4 or 5 ounces of silver was fixed as the marriage present, Ma making no difficulty on that score, but declaring he must have a peep at the young lady. The go-between said she was a respectable girl, and would never allow herself to be seen. However, it was arranged that they should go to the house together, and await a good opportunity. So off they went, Ma remaining outside while the go-between went in, returning in a little while to tell him it was all right. "A relative of mine lives in the same court, and just now I saw the young lady sitting in the hall. We have only got to pretend we are going to see my relative, and you will be able to get a glimpse of her." Ma consented, and they accordingly passed through the hall, where he saw the young lady sitting down with her head bent forward, while some one was scratching her back. She seemed to be all that the go-between had said, but when they came to discuss the money, it appeared the young lady only wanted 1 or 2 ounces of silver, just to buy herself a few clothes, etc. At which Ma was delighted, and gave the go-between a present for her trouble, which just finished up the 3 ounces his fox friend had provided. An auspicious day was chosen, and the young lady came over to his house, when lo! she was hump-backed and pigeon-breasted, with a short neck like a tortoise, and boat-shaped feet, full 10 inches long. The meaning of his fox friend's remark then flashed upon him. End of chapter 62. End of Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, Volume 1, by Song Ling Pu, translated by Herbert Allen Giles.